Good morning. Welcome, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marcin Buzanski. I'm here with the Casimir Pulaski Foundation, the organizers of this beautiful, fantastic event. And it's my enormous, great pleasure to welcome you at the opening of the second day of the 2022 Warsaw Security Forum. We are very, very happy to greet you this morning. And ladies and gentlemen, what an incredible, incredible day we have had during the first day. We have witnessed heads of state, heads of government, foreign ministers, ministers of defense pledge their firm support for Ukraine in their struggle, in their fight against the aggressor. We have seen military leaders and strategists discuss the defense of NATO, the defense of Europe against even the most daunting attack. And we saw what strategies could be taken forward. We have also heard from countless experts, from great specialists looking at the most important security challenges of our time and finding solutions for it. Ladies and gentlemen, today, during the second day of the Warsaw Security Forum, we have much more to come. Let me give you a couple of housekeeping rules here today. We encourage everybody to use your social media. There's a hashtag WSF2022 where you can share your thoughts and your experiences. Please do so. I will also welcome very warmly all our viewers online from all around the world who are joining us during the live stream of today's track. Also, if anybody would require translation, we have simultaneous Ukrainian, Polish, and English. You can find the headsets outside. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to open the democratic resilience track of the Warsaw Security Forum. While security and defense are at threat, we are also fighting for the core of our values. And this is what today is about, discussing the values that connect us in the alliance that we're forming through NATO, through EU, through broadly Western countries, and we are going to look at what the challenges are and how to defeat them. Because it is the values that underpin us which lay at the core of what we are fighting for today, and we have an incredible group of guests that are going to join us, panelists, great leaders who will discuss both the challenges to democratic resilience and how we can address them to secure our way of life today and for generations to come at this pivotal moment in history. Ladies and gentlemen, so without further ado, we will move to the first session of today, and I have the enormous great pleasure to invite for the session the panel Values That We Need to Protect and How to Discuss War with Citizens in Democracy. Incredibly important subject. A fabulous, great moderator, Madame Anja Weller-Schock, with the international editor for Der Tagesspiegel. Please, can I invite you to the stage and ask you to introduce the guests.
Good morning and welcome all to this very first panel. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this panel on such an important topic and how to discuss war with citizens in democracies with a very distinguished panel. It's my pleasure to introduce to my right Rafał Trzaskowski, who has served as the mayor of Warsaw since 2018. He has already held several political positions, including that of Minister of Digitization for his country and member of the European Parliament. Mayor Trzaskowski, let me start by saying thank you very much for welcoming and hosting us in your beautiful city. To my very right is Senator Chris Murphy, who has served as the junior senator from Connecticut since 2013. Times of crisis can be very trying for our democracies and the values that we have built our societies on. And the years of the pandemic and the consequent fallout have certainly shown that. With our panel today, we will be looking at how the Russian invasion has impacted public debate in both Poland and the US, and how we can strengthen the democratic resilience of our societies to prevent negative fallout. With our panelists, we bring together two different perspectives on this issue. One from the US, which has, of course, been a key supporter in the Ukrainian pushback of the Russian aggression, but looks at the war, of course, from a distant perspective. And the other one from Poland, right next door, and the largest recipient country of Ukrainian refugees. Senator Murphy, let me start with you. Yesterday, the US announced a new $625 million security package for Ukraine. At your panel last night, you mentioned a statement by a Trump associate railing against a recent support package, which was published and then quickly removed. What is your assessment of the public debate on the Russian invasion in Ukraine in the US? How strong are the voices opposing US support for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be with the mayor. Thank him greatly for hosting us here this week. Listen, the United States public remains squarely behind Ukraine, as evidenced by our ability to pass a new $12 billion authorization just last week through the United States Congress with broad support from Republicans and Democrats. As I mentioned yesterday on this stage, if you travel throughout the country, whether you're in a Republican-leaning state or a Democratic-leaning state, you're going to see Ukrainian flags out on the front porches of homes and businesses all across America. And I think there are many reasons for that. Listen, we have a strong Ukrainian-American and Polish-American constituency in the United States, but we're a country that has struggled with our own democracy, that maybe has taken our democracy for granted over the years. We obviously had a very high-profile challenge to our democracy in an attempted insurrection in January of last year. And now we see Ukrainians putting their lives on the line to fight for democracy. We see how fragile it is, and maybe we have come to the conclusion that we should fight a little bit harder for ours. I do believe that there is a potential challenge to this consensus coming from President Trump. I do think his political advisors are market testing some messages of opposition to continued aid to Ukraine. There certainly is a constituency in the United States who is always wary of sending aid overseas, and Ukraine is certainly a long ways away. But today, I think Americans are squarely behind the fight for Ukraine. I think they do worry about the post-World War II order falling apart. They have always been proud of the United States and NATO's role in defending that order. And right now, especially as the Ukrainians show such success and bravery on the battlefield, continue to demand that both Republicans and Democrats stand behind the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people.
We're now 1 month away from the US midterm elections. Do you see the war in Ukraine having an impact on the elections?
I don't, again, because right now there is really very little division between Republicans and Democrats. To the extent that there'd be any advantage to a candidate in the midterms on this issue, it would be because a candidate isn't expressing enough support for Ukraine. And in fact, in the few instances where Republicans have voted against Ukraine aid, and there have been a handful of Republicans, some Trump loyalists who have voted against Ukraine aid, but a small handful, they have been very defensive to explain why their votes against these budgets were not related to the money for Ukraine. So I don't think this will be a factor in the midterms because of this consensus that I talked about. I think it's an outstanding question as to whether it will be an issue, heading into the presidential elections.
A quick follow-up before I turn to you, Mayor Trzaskowski. You have been a strong advocate for stricter gun legislation. And when we look at the current security context, the war in Ukraine, recent tensions in the Strait of Taiwan with China, narratives around a possible World War III scenario, do you find it even harder to rally support for gun control in the US?
Well, as much as the American public is very much focused on the security of Europe and the security of Ukraine, they are, of course, much more focused on their own security. And we are a country that has had a dramatic increase in gun violence, and that gun violence often comes at the hands of weapons of war. So you've seen a change in the American public over the last really 4 or 5 years, whereby there's now a consensus in the United States that there are certain weapons that need to be in the hands of the military. They want much more stricter control of handguns, and for the first time in 30 years, we were able to pass legislation this year that begins to tighten our laws around gun violence. And so, yes, in the United States, there is a celebration of the military. There is sometimes a what I would call a fetishization of military weaponry in the United States, but the country is rethinking that position, and you're seeing now more support for a restriction of those military weapons in private hands than ever before.
Mayor Trzaskowski, Poland has been a true champion in welcoming refugees from Ukraine. It is the country with the largest take-in at the moment. About 1.5 million refugees are registered to be residing in Poland. How has this been felt in Poland, and particularly in your city of Warsaw? And do you see a risk that the warm welcome might be cooling off?
First of all, good morning. Welcome to Warsaw. We're very glad that we're hosting this conference. What you've seen in Poland is this incredible feeling of solidarity towards our brothers and sisters from Ukraine. Is basically civil society in action. Of course, the central government did its part on the border, but this welcoming was really done by the people, by non-governmental organizations, and of course with the help of the local governments. If you remember the crisis of 2015, the Mediterranean refugee crisis, there were 200,000 people coming to Europe in a month. And people were panicking, decision makers were panicking, and we felt overwhelmed. 300,000 people came to Warsaw, to one city alone, in a matter of 3 weeks. And we, of course, welcomed them. Many of them left Warsaw, they went to other European countries, many of them returned to Ukraine, but we still have 200,000 Ukrainians in our city, which means that the population of Warsaw has increased by 12%, almost overnight. The problem is that most of what you've seen was improvisation. I remember that I had to call different cities in Europe and ask my friends, mayors of Amsterdam, Milan, and other cities to send us buses so that we could send people to their cities and to their countries. There is no strategy on the national level. The Prime Minister has declared just a month ago that the refugee crisis is over. And unfortunately, sadly, there is also no strategy on the European level because the Polish government didn't ask for it. So there is no voluntary relocation scheme. The budget is very, very small. The new money which appeared to actually help us out, and I know that that's a problem of the member states, not of the European Commission, because the European Commission and the European Parliament are well aware of the problem. By the way, I've seen American money on the ground first through UN agencies, then European money. Thank you for that. My heart, as a convinced European, bleeds, as you can imagine. But of course, this support is incredibly important, which came from the international community, the United States as well. Now, what are the problems? The problem is that yes, the support is still there, and it's not waning for sure. But the problems are before us. Long strategy, long-term problems of education. We have 80,000 kids in Warsaw alone. We've enrolled 20,000 kids already to our schools, but there's still 60,000 in Warsaw. Healthcare, social policy, and so on and so forth. Most of my psychologists who should work with the inhabitants of Warsaw after 2 years of pandemic, after this vicious attack of this government on the LGBT community, we need our psychologists. They work with refugees, and we are fine with that, but of course, that puts an enormous strain on the city, and we are at capacity. So, coming back to your question, the solidarity is still there. But if we do not have a strategy, if we do not share the burden, then of course we might run into problems. Most of our Ukrainian friends are with us, with ordinary people. And once the winter comes and the energy bills are soaring, many people might say, I cannot do it anymore. So the situation might get much more tricky, and that's why we should be watching closely what's going to happen. But the Ukrainians, and that's what the senator said, I mean, we talk about values all the time. I mean, our Ukrainian friends are fighting for them and dying for them. So we need to do our bid, because in a certain sense, we're also on a battlefield here in Poland and in Europe. Everyone is watching. Every crazy despot in the world is watching, whether we will stay united, whether we will still be tough, whether we will be welcoming. So we're also passing a test.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor Trzaskowski. You mentioned the coming winter, rising prices, energy crisis. What could be done to prevent social unrest or growing hostilities?
Well, as I've said, we need a strategy. We need financial support. We need European solutions. Because otherwise it will be immensely difficult to deal with the effects of the war. The solidarity is there. The West was united. We were quite tough and completely different reaction to that of 2014-15. Thanks God for that. But now we're really facing a test, because now there will be a price to be paid by our citizens with the soaring prices of energy, with inflation, and so on and so forth. And now the task of all European and international decision makers is to fight the fatigue syndrome and to keep on convincing people that if we relent, if we renege on some of our promises, if we are not going to support Ukraine militarily, then we're going to fail as a transatlantic community.
Well, you mentioned the fatigue syndrome, and I think communication is key in times of crises. How can we bridge the dilemma? How can governments, politicians, experts communicate transparently with their public about looming threats, about current crisis scenarios, while avoiding fear-mongering and panic among their population? Senator Murphy.
Well, I think, in the United States, the danger is that the war in Ukraine fades from the front pages and from the top of news shows, and the attention of the American public begins to fade. Now, over the course of the last 30 days, it's been back in front of the American public because of high-profile incidents like the attack on the pipeline and the heroic progress of the Ukrainian people. But I think, to the mayor's point, we are trying to explain this in terms that the American public can understand, that this is a means to prevent future conflict, that the Chinese in particular are very much watching what happens here in Ukraine, and their battle plans for Taiwan may be dependent on whether they see the Russian forces stopped and whether they see the Russian economy falling apart. And China is very much a present daily conversation in the United States. So there is an ability to message to the American people that this is, yes, about standing up for the Ukrainian people, but this is also about making sure that the United States doesn't get dragged into future conflicts. Now, admittedly, we don't feel the pain in the same way right now that perhaps Poland does. We have inflation, but not as high. We have energy prices that are increased above 2021 levels, but not as high as they are in Europe. So the pain is significant in the United States, but it's not at the same level as it is right now in parts of Europe. And so that doesn't mean that the American public are enthusiastic to endure that, but they, I think right now, see the connection between the prices that they are having to pay and the long-term benefit to U.S. national security. But again, there is a real risk that if we go back into a period of time in which people in the United States aren't hearing news about Ukraine, it will be just a little bit harder for leaders to explain why we continue to authorize $12 billion, $20 billion of taxpayer assistance for this mission. I think we can do it. It just becomes trickier.
I want to turn to the threat of disinformation. Prime Minister Morawiecki yesterday mentioned that Eastern Europe has ample experience with disinformation, but that he feels that the West has underestimated this threat so far. Mayor Trzaskowski, how can we fight disinformation? How can we make sure that our societies are resilient against disinformation and political interference by bad actors?
Well, yes. I mean, unfortunately, our friends sometimes were wrong on many accounts, but also when it comes to the disinformation campaigns and the threat coming from Russia, I mean, it is immense. I mean, wherever there's conflict, wherever there are elections which are hanging by a thread, I mean, the Russians are there. And it's not just mischief. I mean, they are undermining our democracies everywhere. And this is one of the most serious threats. And this is not just like me, you know, picking up a phone and then having a Zoom conversation with a guy who looks and speaks like Vitaly Klitschko, and then it turns out it was just some pranksters from Russia, of course, there to discredit Klitschko, to discredit other mayors. Because that's relatively benign compared to what they do to our public discourse. And this is incredibly important that we have tools at our disposals to fight it, and that also American companies, this is very important on the net, make their efforts to take it down, to expose it, because otherwise our public will be disinformed all the time and manipulated into taking the wrong decisions. Of course, that also puts an enormous responsibility on some of our governments, because some of our governments are also spreading propaganda and lies. So this is important, that if you want to, you know, point a finger at something, you should be heeding the call yourself. But this is one of the most important threats, that we are being manipulated, that our democracy is being undermined, and that this is real information warfare. So I know that the European Commission is doing a lot in order to counter that, but we should be doing more, much more, especially when it comes to the internet, especially when it comes to the social media. We need to expose it, we need to take it down, we need to verify the information. And the last thing I want to say is education. I have kids, my daughter's 17, my son is 13. Sometimes I sit with them, we talk, we check out the homework and so on, and I always say, what's your source? I mean, you know, Google, with all due respect, is not the only source of information. And Google verifies its information mostly, but sometimes you just get information out of the blue on the internet. So verify your information, and you have to teach children to do exactly that. And I know that American companies are working on it to also verify information and to have special techniques in order to fight misinformation and lies. But we need to do more, and we need to teach our children that they need to verify the information that they use. This is a very important skill that we need to teach.
Thank you, Mayor. Senator Murphy, how can we fight disinformation without impeding freedom of speech, for example?
Well, listen, I agree wholeheartedly with the mayor. We are simply not doing enough. Years ago, I wrote legislation along with Republican Senator Rob Portman, establishing something called the Global Engagement Center. And this is a capacity of the State Department that helps fund independent and objective media around the world that fight disinformation, the fact checkers, the truth tellers. And we put about $60 to $80 million a year into that program. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that the Chinese and the Russians are spending on disinformation. It just makes absolutely no sense that we are not putting more money into combating disinformation globally. The problem in the United States is that this is becoming a very partisan issue right now. Republicans increasingly take the position that the social media companies should engage in zero content moderation because their belief is that that content moderation is somehow subverting and depressing conservative voices. So you are about to potentially have Elon Musk take over Twitter with a promise that he will not only allow President Trump back onto the platform, but really ramp down a lot of the efforts to stamp out the most extreme voices. So we're in a difficult position in the United States because one party right now is not taking seriously the issue of making sure that some of these incredibly nefarious actors aren't spreading lies online. At the very least, though, in the United States, the foreign-run media, we can do something about that. So we have a radio station, for instance, in Washington, D.C., one of the most powerful stations in Washington, D.C., that is owned by Sputnik Radio. So you have literally Russian propaganda being piped into the nation's capital every single day. You have TikTok, still largely unregulated in the United States, a Chinese-owned social media app that is right now the most popular amongst our children. So we're having a difficult time in the United States when it comes to sort of what we do on social media platforms, but some of it shouldn't be as difficult. We should be putting more money into these international efforts, and we should be drawing some brighter lines in the United States, especially when it comes to the foreign-owned information propaganda sites that right now are proliferating inside the United States.
I just want to, I of course agree with the senator, and yes, there is a debate about, of course, as always, freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But I mean, most of the Russian propaganda is propagated by bots and by artificial sites, and these can be readily identified. So at least let's start with that. It should be not that controversial, because I mean, if there is a real there is a real person behind it, then we can debate it, okay? And of course, there are some people who are paid to spread lies, and so on and so forth. But most of the propaganda is just simply, you know, mechanically generated. So let's start with that, and I think that should be at least relatively uncontroversial.
And before we turn to the audience for one or two questions, I wanted to ask you, Mayor Trzaskowski, to speak a little bit about the Pact of Free Cities that you started in 2019 with the countries from the Visegrad Group. Has this made a difference in Warsaw, and can this be a best practice for other cities to build resilient democratic societies?
Well, yes. You know, there are quite a lot of networks of cities, both in Europe and in the world. I'm also a proud member of the Committee of the Regions, Eurocities, C40, which fights with global warming. But we've decided to create a network of cities who are a bit more political and who want to fight for values of democracy, transparency, tolerance, and openness. We started the four mayors of the Visegrad countries, Budapest, Bratislava, Prague, and Warsaw, because we also wanted to demonstrate that our part of Europe can also stand for freedom and transparency and tolerance in those difficult times. But then other cities joined, such as recently Berlin, Brussels, but also Paris, London, Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. And we are sending a message that we can collaborate, that we can learn from one another, and that we can be a voice for democracy. Because it somehow happens that populists do not win cities. It is much more difficult for them. It is also about direct financing from the European budget, a little bit for city initiatives and so on and so forth. And I'm very glad that the administration of President Biden has very similar ideas, because they have created this pact of cities for democracy and signed a declaration signed by so many cities in different parts of the world. In a certain sense, we all are getting involved in global politics. Look at Warsaw. When I was becoming a mayor, people were saying, yeah, we'll just look into the future, construct infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And it turned out that it's sixth wave of pandemic that we're dealing with. We're running 11 hospitals. That it's the war, the migration crisis, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, because the government, the current central government in Poland cannot deliver on its promises, 2 days ago the Deputy Prime Minister said that we should be selling coal and distributing coal. Those are the ideas that the government has. Anyhow, we are at the forefront of all of those challenges that are before us. Global warming, digitization, fighting misinformation, and so on and so forth. So that's why the role of the cities, whether we like it or not, has become global. and we better do something about it, and we better be recognized as important actors, especially for those forces who want to fight for democracy, openness, freedom, transparency, and tolerance.
Thank you, Mayor, for this passionate plea. I'd like to invite you to ask a question to the Senator or to Mayor Trzaskowski. If you're interested, please raise your hand. Yes, the gentleman over there. Please go to the microphone in the back and briefly introduce yourself.
Dear Mr. Mayor, dear Mr. Senator, I would like to ask you a short question. How do you evaluate last Twitter of Elon Musk about Russian-Ukrainian Peace Act, and should the leaders of public opinion of such scale to express their opinion on such important political issues?
Well, listen, I mean, this isn't the first time that Elon Musk has offered a controversial political opinion. It's not that people in the United States don't take his suggestions and opinions seriously, but they form their own. And right now, as the American people watch both the heroism and the effectiveness of the Ukrainian army's ability to take territory back, it seems like a particularly foolish time to be advocating for a capitulation. So at the same time that Elon Musk was suggesting that we give away territory to the Russians, the United States Congress, as I mentioned, was supporting a new $12 billion authorization of military aid. Now, I think my position is the same as the Biden administration's position. It is up to the Ukrainian people through their government to decide for themselves when and if there is a moment to sit down across the table from the Russians and enter into a negotiation. But right now, the American people, I think I can safely say, have no interest in forcing that discussion to happen. In fact, right now, the very opposite is occurring. We are trying to provide more leverage and more support for the Ukrainian military.
I mean, I'm just going to quote President Zelensky, because just an hour after Elon Musk tweeted, he also made a quiz. Which Elon Musk do you like more? The one who was helping Ukraine with Starlink and so on and so forth, or the one who is trying to make political statements? That's for you to decide.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've already reached the end of our discussion, so I'd like to thank our two panelists and stress that with the winter coming, that will certainly pose challenges. We need to make sure to stress openly and transparently to citizens to stand by the commitment to support our friends and partners in Ukraine. And with that, thank you very much, Senator Murphy and Mayor Trzaskowski.
If I may, I was always finishing with one sentence, which is enjoy Warsaw and spend as much money as you can. But in those difficult times, I want to say just one thing. Looking at this incredible courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people, we in Warsaw, we are helping because we know when a crazy guy wants to wipe out your city from the map. That's what happened to Warsaw, which was destroyed in 90%. So when we see Ukrainian cities, we are absolutely certain that they will be rebuilt, that they will be dynamic, and this incredible courage of the Ukrainian people will carry the country forwards. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speakers of the first panel. Thank you, Mayor Trzaskowski. Thank you, Senator Murphy. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the second session of the day, and it will begin with remarks by a great leader, by Madame Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is the leader of the democratic movement, for the Belarus democratic movement, and a truly inspiring figure to tell us more about the resilience in action and fighting for a democratic Belarus and protecting her independence from Russia. Madame Tikhanovskaya, if we can invite you to the stage for the opening remarks.
So, dear Excellencies, dear friends, dear Minister Mantas Adaminas, Minister Chaputovich, Honorable Oksana Ustinova, Honorable Steve Cohen. It's an honor for me to be here today with you. 2 years ago, Belarus rose up against the bloody dictatorship that has been destroying the country for 27 years. Thousands of people took to the streets not because of economic or social problems, but first and foremost because they wanted self-respect and democratic freedoms. They wanted a real independent state. In 2020, Belarusians decisively chose their future, that of a free European nation. But with the help of Vladimir Putin, the dictator trampled over people's choice. A free and independent Belarus terrified both dictators. They needed a political desert from which to launch missiles at Ukraine and threaten peace in Europe. Our story is an example of resilience and unity that Belarusians have shown in the face of repressions. Over 50,000 of illegal detentions and 4,000 years of stolen lives for political prisoners made Belarusians face fear, but it hasn't divided us. We have stayed united against the full force of Lukashenko's repression since 2020. In 2022, we united in helping Ukraine to win. 86% of Belarusians are against Belarus' participation in Russia's war. You may have heard stories of our railway partisans who stopped Russian trains. Dozens of them face up 20 years of prison, and some face death penalty. We keep our fingers crossed for our military volunteers in Ukraine. 15 lost their lives already. As I speak, Belarusian battalion is part of Ukraine's counteroffensive, chasing the invaders away. We all understand that the speed of changes at the Ukrainian front opens new opportunities for Belarus, and it's moving so fast. So must we. To stay united and resilient, we have created the United Transition Cabinet as the central executive body of the Belarusian democratic movement. This will remain until new elections are held. The cabinet includes representatives of major political groups and will represent the interests of Belarusian people. We are working tirelessly to set out our Belarusian vision to leave the decades of darkness behind and create a bright future, a nation reborn. And I'm here to share it with you. We see democratic Belarus as the centerpiece of European security. We are a country that will be valued for friendship towards its neighbors, cooperating on regional security, no longer a dark and threatening cloud hanging over the region. we also see a path there. Today, we have what we lacked in 2020. First, we have a united population who is even less supportive of the regime than in 2020 and disgusted by the war. Second, we have crumbling economic prospects for the regime due to sanctions. Third, we were unable to crack the officials and security apparatus in 2020. But now, for the first time ever, we have trained Belarusian units in Ukraine. And as you can see, Lukashenko is afraid of them very much. Fourth, we have a distracted Russia that is about to lose this war. It won't be able to prop Lukashenko up with money and military support as in 2020. And fifth, we have united and experienced Belarusian democratic leadership that has a broad coalition of friends. We have you. Right now is our window of opportunity. Right now is our time to act. We are preparing tirelessly, but we can't fully prepare without your help. Right now is when Belarus should be on the top of any international meeting agenda along with Ukraine. It became clear that there will be no safe Ukraine and there will be no safe Europe without free Belarus. Belarus is not only part of the problem, it's also part of the solution. I'm thankful to Poland, Lithuania, the EU, and the United States for being our devoted supporters. Thanks to your consistent position, Lukashenko's regime was isolated, and civil society and independent media resumed their work. But more can be done. First, distinguish Belarusians from the regime. We call it two-sided approach. Punish the dictator, but help the people. We should keep Belarusians in European orbit, keep and strengthen ties between the people of Belarus and the rest of Europe. Visa ban on Belarusians is not a solution. Instead, consider closing loopholes so Lukashenko and Putin cannot avoid sanctions. Second, we should maintain and expand our coalition. I was at UN General Assembly last week, and unfortunately, the rest of the world has a very little understanding what's happening in Belarus and Ukraine. Secure Europe is in the interest of the world, as the gas, grain, and migrant crisis have shown. Europe can't be safe with two rogue states in the east running around bullying neighbors and threatening nuclear war. Third, we also need your Ukrainian support. No aid delivery can help Ukraine as much as eliminating 1,000 kilometers of Belarus-Ukraine hostile border to defend. We should work together on building an alliance between Ukraine and democratic Belarus. We ask Ukraine to establish cooperation with the United Transitional Cabinet. We realize that nobody apart from Belarusians can bring changes to Belarus. We learned to be self-sufficient. We learned it is a marathon. Our independence, our security and democracy are for us to ensure. But we want you to stand with us and our vision. Dear friends, let's remind ourselves, unlike thousands of those behind bars, we have the freedom to act. Not to fake deep concerns, but to make a real difference. Now it's our turn. Now it's time for us to lead. Thank you. Слава Україні! І Живи Беларусь! Дякую.
Thank you very much, Madame Chikhanouskaya, for those inspiring words. Ladies and gentlemen, they have opened up for an incredibly important discussion where we have some fabulous guests to follow. And for that, I will invite a great moderator, Mr. David Ignatius, an associate editor at the Washington Post. David, please join us. Welcome to Warsaw.
Of Belarus. First, Alexandra Ustinova, who's a member of the Ukrainian parliament. Mantas Adomėnas, who is the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania. Jacek Kaputuec, who is the former Foreign Minister of Poland. And I'm pleased that Svetlana has agreed to join us on stage for a few questions after her excellent address. So, Svetlana Sakhanovia. So, just to introduce our discussion, Belarus is the other great freedom fight in Eastern Europe. It's been overshadowed by Ukraine, but is important in this broad story. And I want to, in the brief time I have with Svetlana, who's going to leave us after these two questions, ask you a couple of very simple issues. First, what can the Belarus opposition do for the Ukrainian people in the period of their struggle that's ahead? You talked about things that have been done in the past. Going forward, as this war continues, what can the opposition do to help Ukraine?
So, first of all, it's not opposition, but Belarusian people who would like to help Ukrainians to win. Because we, as I said in my speech, we realize that without free Ukraine, there will be no free Belarus, and we fully understand this. So it's our task, it's our obligation, not only fight with the regime in Belarus, but also help as we can in our situation, Ukrainians to help, to win. So at the moment, hundreds of Belarusian volunteers, military volunteers, are fighting in Ukraine. It's, you know, they are defending not only Ukraine, but also defending Belarus. They actually on the counter-offensive of Ukrainian army at the moment, liberating the lands of our neighboring country. Then now we see that there are signs that Russian troops can deploy Belarusian land again, and we are preparing our partisans, you know, to act decisively at this very moment. The acts of sabotage that took place in February and March can be repeated again, though people who are making these acts of sabotage can face death penalty. But it's like our feature of Belarusians, you know, to step over fears and to act to help Belarus and help Ukraine. So I'm sure that Belarusians will again be involved in sabotaging railways, in giving information to Ukrainian army, and you know, to prepare maybe Ukrainians for possible attacks. Also, we in Belarus we counter to Russian propaganda. State television in Belarus, they reiterate Russian narrative about Nazism, about enemy, external enemies, and it's our task to inform people what's going on in reality. And if younger generation can use internet, they know how to look for alternative source of media, of information. Older generation, they, especially in villages, they don't know where to read the truth. So that's why there is organized volunteer movement in Belarus that spread self-made newspapers. For example, when the war has started, about 500,000 leaflets have been spread to inform Belarusians about the war and who is guilty in this war. And of course, on political arena, we are fully supporting Ukrainian cause. We are really appreciate all the help and assistance that Ukraine gets from democratic, powerful countries, because as we explained this, now it's not the fight, it's not the war between Ukraine and Russia. It's the war between democratic values and dictatorship on the territory of Ukraine, and it's moral obligation of all the powerful democratic countries to be with Ukrainians at the moment, but of course not to overlook Belarus.
I'm sure you saw, Svetlana, and our audience did, President Lukashenko said yesterday that, that Belarus is in this war participating with Russia, and he also announced that Belarus is modernizing its railroads so that it can provide greater transport for the new Russian mobilization to get into battle. So you have your work cut out for you. Let me ask you one more question, and it's the reverse of what I asked a moment ago. What can Ukraine do for the Belarus opposition so that you have a better chance to break through yourselves in your country? You talked about Ukraine recognizing your Belarus opposition. What beyond that specifically would help you?
So first of all, Lukashenko is not president. You called him President Lukashenko. He is not.
I should have called you Madam President. I'm sorry.
Yeah, he has lost elections in 2020 and doesn't have right to represent Belarusian people anywhere. I think that it's high time for Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people to install closer relationship with Belarusian nation and Belarusian democratic forces. It took us a long time since the war has started to explain Ukrainians what's going on in Belarus. Since 2020, we felt everyday pain for what's going on in our country, for political prisoners, for detentions, for tyranny and tortures, and we were sure that the whole world knows about this, that Ukrainian friends also know about this. But when the war has started, we realized that we unexpectedly for us became co-aggressors in this war, and it took us some time to speak to Ukrainian people that regime of Lukashenko and Belarusian people are not the same. That it's regime, it's Lukashenko who became collaborant, but Belarusian people are against this. So since then, I see that these ties between Belarusian and Ukrainian nation is closer and closer, and I think that Ukrainians also understand the importance of Belarusian victory over dictatorship. It's for the sake of both our countries. We see that Kremlin doesn't recognize no Ukraine, no Belarus as independent states, and we are like in one boat, and we have to fight together. So that's why we are asking Ukrainian government to install closer relationship with our United Transitional Cabinet to work for to work out like our common strategy, how to fight with these Russian ambitions. So we already have contacts on the working level, but we would like to see more signs that we are together. I understand that Ukrainian government face such huge difficulties, this war and all this stuff, but I'm sure that if we show our unity, it will be a strong signal for our democratic political partners that we are together, that we are interested in freedom of both our countries. So, and on the level of ordinary people, it's so important to support each other. I know how Belarusians are trying to support like Ukrainian cause, at least in media, because we don't have like other tools. And we'd like Ukrainian people to learn more about how Belarusians lived before 2020 and what happened in 2020 and what we are doing now. So to to understand both our nations better. And moreover, we can clearly understand each other even without interpretation, because our languages are very close. We can understand each other without, And so this is like, this ties between democratic forces and government and ties between nations should be strengthening.
So I want to thank Svetlana for these additional comments, answering my questions. And I'd ask the audience to join me again in saluting a very courageous woman. I want to say, Madam President. So let's turn now to the question that Svetlana has put to us, and I want to ask each of you briefly to answer this in your own way. I'll start with you, Alexandra. She spoke in her speech about a window of opportunity for Belarus, given the war, given the dramatic evidence of Russian weakness. How do you think that Belarus can best exploit that window of opportunity now and make progress? Alexandra?
Thank you so much. I think the best window of opportunities for Belarus would be Ukraine to win. And I think everybody realizes that Russia, or the Russian Empire, that's how Putin sees it, cannot exist without Belarus or Ukraine. He has to have it. And the best opportunity window is for us to fight back together and win this war. Because yesterday Lukashenko de facto acknowledged the Belarusian participation in this war. And there is no other solution but to stop it. If we talk about the opposition, and I can tell you that Ukrainians had been so supportive when the first protests in Belarus started. I remember in 2020. I had friends coming and living in my house who were escaping. And we, as the parliament, had been trying to draw attention of the government. We had statements from the president supporting the opposition and not the self-proclaimed Putin's puppet, who Lukashenko is. But today, we as Ukrainians are asking Belarus and Belarusians to fight more. We are grateful for projects like Gayun that we know and we read and we know what is going on with the Russian army in Belarus. We are very grateful for the guerrillas, for people who are fighting for us. But we need more people to come out and fight. It cannot be comparable. You cannot compare Belarusians and Russians, because 86% of Belarusians do not support the war. And if you turn to Russians, the majority of people do support that. But it shouldn't be, but the resistance should be stronger for this opportunity window to stay open and for us to win.
Bantas, what do you think about this window? And do you think the evident weakness of the Russian military in Ukraine is harming Lukashenko's standing now in Belarus with his own people?
I think it's very much a race against time. On the one hand, pressure by Russia to integrate Belarus more and more deeply and sort of give up the last vestiges of semblance of any sovereignty that it still possesses. On the other hand, the disaffection of Belarusian society and of Belarusian elites, which is, I think, also very important. In a sense, they see this as a losing sort of ship, well, a sinking ship they tied the boat to. But before going further, I want to take a step back, in a sense, David, and to emphasize what you said, the strategic importance of Belarus. I mean, you said that it tends to be overlooked in the context of a much larger war of Russia and Ukraine. But Belarus tended to be in the strategic thinking of the West like a kind of blank area for many years. It was a sort of murky corner where nothing much was happening, with a kind of pantomime dictator. And now it has become an absolutely strategic center of the new geopolitical developments. You know, if Russia did not control Belarus, there would not be Suwalki Gap, which is a kind of strategic bottleneck for NATO. There would not be an opportunity to attack, as has been mentioned, Kiev from the north. There would not be this 1,000 kilometer, and I think not less importantly, there would not be a sort of Soviet Union restoration project, because Belarus and Russia is what remains of the restoration project. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we're prepared to take every window of opportunity, which I think may next come with sort of the earliest big window of opportunity is Putin's defeat in Ukraine and demoralization both of Russian army, as well as the layers of the elite that sort of will see themselves on the losing side, and that will be sort of major, and we have to prepare for that. But again, sort of this should not be seen as a panacea, because such regimes can have strange tendency for survival. So we should also prepare for the long game. And the long game is building up Belarusian identity, helping democratic Belarusians to build this identity of free European nation, which is at the center of Europe, at the center of things are happening. So we cannot miss this coming window of opportunity, but also we should not sort of put all our eggs in that basket and think that there will be a quick win necessarily. I mean, we have to prepare for the long haul, but we cannot afford to lose Belarus to Russia.
Yes, what would you say about this window of opportunity? You've been watching as Foreign Minister of Poland, Lukashenko, for a long time. What thoughts do you have?
I think that this window of opportunity will come after Ukrainian victory. I believe it will realize soon, and it may lead to the internal troubles in Russia. And Russia supports Lukashenko. Without this support, he will not remain as a leader of the country. So we have to be prepared, and I am pleased to hear from Svetlana Tikhanovskaya that opposition is being prepared to that by creation of this united transitional cabinet to be ready to act immediately, because I believe that without Russian support for regime, it will not sustain, and Belarusians have to be prepared to fight for their independence. Let me add also to that our support for Belarus goes through the support for Ukraine. I fully agree with Alexandra that military support, financial support, economic support, political support for Ukraine in this war is the same as supporting Belarusian opposition, because only Ukrainian victory can trigger changes within the Belarusian state, the Belarusian society. I believe that in future we will be in one, so to say, format. It happened that we in this panel represent 3 countries belonging to so-called Lublin Triangle: Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, and there is the room also for Belarus there, if there is a Belarusian state. So there is also a change of mentality in our region. We understand that we have to be united against threat which comes from Russia.
Let me ask the 2 foreign ministers, current and former members of the foreign ministry, to explain something that puzzles me. Many of Russia's neighbors have been seizing this moment of Putin's weakness to find greater space. For example, Kazakhstan. For example, Armenia. For example, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. A little more distance from Moscow. We don't see anything like that yet from Belarus. Do you think that's possible? Let me start with you, Montas, and then Jacek.
I don't think that's possible as long as Lukashenko is in power. And of course, he will try to put across this sort of narrative, which is a kind of a totally flogged to death horse that, sort of, he is the only guarantor of Belarusian sort of sovereignty and independence, and something that he tried to put across. And time again, sort of democratic politicians fell for it. Sort of, we should support Lukashenko because what may come next is either the total surrender to Russia or someone even worse. And but. To be manipulated is and to continue to be manipulated is not something can become a sort of basis for a reliable sort of policy. So we should really see through this narrative. Lukashenko is currently becoming a total sort of ventriloquist dummy for Putin, and his remarks about Belarus participation, you see the game he's playing. He's on the one hand, he's forced to say that we are in the special operation. On the other hand, trying to portray that, okay, well, we are sort of in, but not with our troops. So trying to walk this tightrope. But the game is becoming more increasingly thin. So as long as Lukashenko is there, he's no longer in control of the situation. He has been master manipulator, but has been out-manipulated by Putin, has no strategic space, and is not seeking to gain any. He's only trying to portray himself to those gullible Western politicians who still think that there is a sort of dialogue possible, that he's somehow a lesser evil than Putin, and maybe should be somehow appeased. There is no hope in that. There is no perspective. It's a dead end.
Jacek, what do you think about whether there's any space available for him?
I think that you just mentioned these countries which look for room for their own policy. They sense, they understand the weakness of Vladimir Putin, a weakness of Russia in this war. So without this glue, it's difficult to maintain this relations. Therefore, there are tensions. As far as Belarus is concerned, let me also draw your attention to the fact that, however, we can criticize Lukashenko for breaking human rights, and I think sanctions are justified on Belarus. But on the other hand, he's not side to this war. So the Belarusian army haven't invaded Ukraine. You could imagine at the very beginning that these two countries will act in alliance. So I think that he cannot be compared to Putin as far as responsibility for this is concerned. It is, of course, because he's clever. There is an attitude amongst Belarusians that war should be criticized. They could not be involved in this war. But we can also, we should also recognize that they do not contribute to the suffering of Ukrainians. Of course, he could be criticized for allowing its territory for Russian army to be used and so on. But on the other hand, it is not the same position. So we'll see what will happen. I repeat again that his future depends on the future of Vladimir Putin after probable, expected maybe, or we would like that it would be like that, collapse of the regime in Russia. We have to be prepared to this. His end is obvious as a leader of Belarus. The society will elect democratic representations, definitely, I think, with the participation of opposition, which is now on exile.
So I want to ask Alexandra to follow up on that, and I'm going to put the question this way. Do the Ukrainian people see Belarus as a victim of aggression, or do they see Belarus as an aggressor?
You know, I think we should separate Belarusians and the state of Belarus, because we honestly believe that Lukashenko should be accountable and should be responsible for what is being done, but not the people who are suffering from this dictator at the moment. On the other side, of course, we as Ukrainians keep asking the Belarusians to stand up. This is the time, the best time for them, probably even better than in 2020, to stand up against him, because Putin is weak. He has already betrayed Armenia with the conflict with Azerbaijan, and that's why they're pulling back. And he will continue to become weaker with our army going north, east, and south. And the weaker he is, the better chances internally are there for people to stand up against their tyranny and against, for people of Belarus to stand up against Lukashenko. So we had always been supportive for people. But of course, we see that this is the government who is accountable. If we could consider all of these people being victims, I would say on one hand, yes. On the other, probably Ukrainians had never been so proud of their own country. We're paying an enormous price for that. Thousands of people die every day. And that's why when we hear from other nations that we are afraid to stand up, we as Ukrainians do not understand it. We did not understand it in 2014 because we died for our freedom back then, and we do not understand it now. That's why we're asking not to be victims, but to be those who stand up and fight for their own countries, and then it will be a common victory for everybody.
That's powerfully said. This may be the moment. It may not come again. Montes.
I want to pick up on what Alexander said. I think I totally agree that unlike Russia, where I truly believe this is not Putin's war, it's Russia's war. It's a society which allowed itself to be indoctrinated, which has turned sort of in ideological fervor sort of to support this regime and is still supporting, and the fact that it tries to flee personal danger is not an indication of any resistance. In Belarusian case is different. It's very much Lukashenko's participation in the war, but then again, I would like to disagree with His Excellency Minister on evaluation of the facts. Yes, Belarusian units did not directly engage, but they allowed military exercise to be turned into the beginning of the war. They allowed the territory to be used. They allowed the territory to be used from which missiles were launched. Now they're preparing to train Russian troops, and they're providing ammunition. So the fact that it is a sort of, Lukashenko is a Mussolini to Putin's Hitler is not sort of, does not relieve him of responsibility. The precise amount of this responsibility will have to be evaluated by an international tribunal. I'm not sort of prepared to sort of venture a suggestion, but responsibility is there. He's an aiding and abetting this war. He's an accomplice of this war, and I think we should be very clear that there should be no principle sort of line drawn between the two regimes and their sort of complicity in this crime of aggression.
So we're going to turn to the audience for your questions in a moment, be thinking about them, but I want to ask one more question of Jacek. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about what a post-Ukraine war Belarus might look like, what role it might play in the region, and whether a Western-looking Belarus will help pull Russia west with it. Does that make a difference, or do you think the pressures are already there to pull Russia westward?
So I think that first big question is the end of this war, how it will finish, and of course everybody in Poland, in the West, supports Ukraine and wishes that Ukraine win. And I think now we have to simply be prepared for the collapse of Russia as a state, because it will be very difficult to accept for leadership in Russia, particularly Vladimir Putin, a defeat, a failure in this war. So this is the big problem. I don't know if we in the West are prepared for this scenario, which may happen. And it will be no time to reflect on this. And it will be an opportunity for other countries and even regions within Russia to be more independent or to be more self-governed. So again, I will repeat what was already here said. The only way to act these days to support this line of thinking and this positive from our perspective scenario is to support militarily Ukraine and financially, and not to be blackmailed by the Russians in the field of energy security, for example. it is premature to say what would be the role of particular countries. I am sure that Poland will be a leading country in supporting Ukraine until the end. But I have an impression that more say will have these countries which support Ukraine these days. So I see United States, United Kingdom, Poland, countries of our regions. So now we can forge relations in the region between Poland and Ukrainians. I am very pleased to read that way of thinking about Ukrainians in Poland changed very positively and vice versa. So we treat ourselves as rather as kind of a brothers, if you can use this word. We have these relations with Lithuania and believe also that Belarus will come to this camp. Yes, let me also refer to remark of Minister Adomaitis that I agree that Lukashenko is responsible, but however, the fact that Belarusians are not fighting to arm with Russians against Ukraine will help to reconcile and to maintain good social relations between Ukraine and Belarus in future, because the relations between Russians and Ukrainians, difficult to imagine that they will improve due to the psychological effect of war, of killing, mass killing. So, fully agree that Lukashenko is also responsible for enabling this war, but at the same time, I will repeat that there is difference between Putin and Lukashenko in terms of responsibility.
Alexandra, you wanted to jump in on this.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just want to make it clear, and I think Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in her speech said about that as well. It would be a totally different war without Belarus, because a 1,000-kilometer border and missiles, ballistic rockets, and everything flying to Ukraine from Belarus is what is destroying the infrastructure and killing thousands of people. Irpin, Bucha, all these massacres would not have happened if Belarus did not help. But the problem is the sanctions that are introduced now by the international community are weak. It's not even about the loopholes, it's nothing. Because there are sanctions at Lukashenko, but none of his military men. Nobody is responsible for those who actually help them launch those rockets or missiles. There is no responsibility for them, and they do not understand that they will end up in the International Criminal Court or International Tribunal if this ever is going to be a tribunal, if it's ever going to be established. We hope it will. So the problem is these people do not understand their own responsibility, and it's the West that has to pressure with more sanctions, more powerful sanctions, to bring justice and accountability, not only for Lukashenko personnel and his family, but for the rest who are involved as well.
So there's a specific takeaway for me, the recommendation for more specific sanctions against Belarus itself now as a deterrent on its actions. So let me turn to the audience. Please raise your hands, identify yourselves. We do have mic runners today, so yes, sir, in the second row. And if you have want to direct this to a particular panelist, please do so.
Thank you, David. Christoph Marschall from the German daily Der Tagesspiegel in Berlin. I have a question which arose from your discussion. Why are not more countries, people fighting back? Normally we see in history, when you have a war and it's the end game, every nation who has still some claims wants to join the fight in order to get their piece of victory back. So we have frozen conflicts all over at the borders of Russia. Do you expect a moment when people in Transnistria will take the fight, when people in Georgia will take the fight? Or why are they not doing it? Because I could also imagine that the West is not very much interested because it raises risks. It could trigger the escalation most of us don't want to see. So how do you see this developing? Is it a question of time when others will raise up, or is it not going to happen because the West doesn't encourage such a kind of behavior?
That's a great question. Are we facing another 1989, in other words? Who wants to jump on that?
I may start. Honestly, as a Ukrainian, I can tell you that I personally believe that frozen conflicts is a very comfortable term, probably that the West has been using. And it was a very comfortable term for everybody since 2014, when we as Ukrainians, even here at this forum, were begging for help and crying that he's not going to stop, Nobody was listening. And the same is in any other country, unfortunately. So it was the international community who pressured people to step back and not fight against the evil, against Russia, who did not help back then. So hopefully, if there is help internally coming, these people will raise. I honestly believe that Russia will fall apart. And we are going to have, I don't know, what, 20, 25 countries evolving. And the worst is, the West is not ready for that either. There is no strategy for that, whether in the United States or in Europe. And that's why Ukraine is not getting all the weapons needed. And this is the problem, because nobody wants us to win. Everybody wants us to hold Putin, to fight it there, and have a so-called frozen conflict. Because if we win, there is no strategy in the world of what to do with Russia and with any 20 or 25 states with nuclear weapons that are going to end up the world with. So unfortunately, this is the problem that everybody has to sit down and talk about now honestly, and not to pretend that there are frozen conflicts. I'm sorry, thank you.
Well said. Montes.
I think that's precisely what we're saying, that, there is going to be no stability and security in Europe until Ukraine is restored to 2014 borders, the pre-2014 borders, and there are reparations and there is a sort of responsibility for the crimes of aggression. But I think it's also very important to realize that the earlier pieces, the 2008 aggression, the Transnistria, Abkhazia, they are also part of the same puzzle. We just see the culmination of the process of grabbing territories by Russia. So there should be no going back on the part of the West to reduction of sanctions until these territories are also restored. And this is not a matter between Georgia and Russia, between Moldova and Russia. Countries which, for very different reasons, are in a weak position and are not trying to use this geopolitical opportunity to claim the territories back for different reasons. I'm not going to into analyzing them, but it is for us to make sure that the 1991 borders are respected and restored to the right, and the territories are restored to the rightful owners, and the territorial integrity. So the West has been on the learning curve since 2008. The reaction to the invasion of South Ossetia has been extremely weak. Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea were totally unsatisfactory. We're still on the learning curve, and we should realize that it's not escalation is the word that we should prohibit. All escalation that is needed has been introduced by Putin. What we are trying to do is to restore stability and order, and that's not going to happen until Russia is pushed out of the territories and until it cannot portray its aggressive policy as leading to any sort of territorial victory. Because for that regime, it's going to be an incitement for further acts of aggression. So until that happens, there is going to be no lasting stability in Europe.
So I'm going to turn back. Let's take a couple more questions from the audience, and we'll come back to our panel for closing comments. Is there anyone on this side who would like to be recognized? Not seeing any hands. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Amanda Rifkin. I'm in the newsroom for Deutsche Welle, and I would like to talk a little bit about when Russia does collapse, because I am with the panel on this. It's inevitable at this point. In Poland, after 1989, we had an indigenous economist, Leszek Balcerowicz, totally overhaul the market and make it into a functioning market economy that we see today. What will this look like in Belarus? And in Russia itself, what will the morning after Putin look like? My suspicion is that the person that will do it is the one closest to him. It will be Patrushev. I don't know if this is something that the panel would agree with, or if there are other prognoses or thoughts on what that would look like, but I would be very curious to hear.
The day after, let's take another question. Yes, you're in the fourth row.
Hello, my name is Rick. I'm a researcher from Maastricht University. My research goes into autocratic resilience and democratic promotion by the EU. So my question is mostly directed to Ms. Radomenas and Chaputovich. To what extent see the Poles and Lithuanians, their voices heard within the wider EU with regard to Belarus, Are you finding roadblocks? Are you finding openings with your partners in the West, mainly Netherlands, France, and Germany, as these countries have less experience, less historical and societal experience with Belarus and the post-Soviet space? Thank you very much.
So we have just over 2 minutes left, and let's have concluding comments. Jacek, you first?
Yes, let's be referred to the last question. Indeed, our countries support democracy in the eastern part of Europe, especially in Belarus. When you look at the policy of main EU countries like Germany and France, in my opinion, they look at the region through their relations with Russia, which they prioritize. And it is why they do not see these developments as clearly as we do in Ukraine or in Belarus. So it was a mistake. It was recognized that you cannot look at the relations in the or phrase them or understand them as a kind of a concert of Europe, 19th century concert of Europe, where Russia is perceived as an indispensable element of European security system. You have to also see these smaller countries and nations and acknowledge that they have also their right to independence, to sovereign development. So there is a difference. Sometimes Poland is portrayed as a country which is against, so to say, European values. No, these are European values. You have to support a weaker side in the conflict, like Ukraine. You have to understand aspiration of nations like Belarus. These are European values. You cannot look at relations in this realistic geopolitical power relations, like it has been done until now by Germany and France.
Montas.
There's been a window of susceptibility following 24th of February when major powers of the EU said, well, if only we had listened to what you were saying about Russia. Because before that, Lithuania, Baltic countries, Poland had been branded as Russophobes, sort of who are panicking needlessly. Our panicking turned out to be extremely accurate prediction of its behavior. So this susceptibility is somewhat decreasing, and there is a sort of tendency to revert to listening mode, which is sort of arrogance as usual. That's to say, we know better. What can you tell us? Sort of, we are old, established sort of powers. I think it's very important. But EU is a dialogue. It is a sort of, it's a polylogue. So the voice is heard. We do manage to put it across, and I think sort of, it's not impeded. The question about the day after. Well, that's precisely the task for the United Transitional Cabinet, to work out scenarios for sort of viable transition. And the more cogent, the more persuasive it is, the more likely it is to grab the imagination of the Belarusian people. I said, the long game is building this sort of it's European independent identity of Belarusian nation as a nation in Europe, and this is a work which needs to convince that there is a viable Belarus without sort of Russia's constant injections. There is viable Belarus which can be can be democratic and work and sort of not be reliant on the state sector. So it's an immense task. And I'm very happy that Belarusian democratic opposition is uniting for this task, and it's working together to actually work out this sort of the reforms, and not just political reforms, which are obvious, free elections and all that, and justice for Lukashenko, but also what are they going to do in welfare reform, in economy, in all these areas, So this is a work which is ongoing, and we need to support it by all means.
Alexandra.
I'll be brief. On the second question, it's never too late to start listening. The world hasn't listened to us before. On Nord Stream 2 in 2014, you can start listening now and help us now. Unfortunately, this is not happening as well. As I have already mentioned, we're not getting enough weapons to win this war. And on the second question, I can tell you exactly what Ukrainians are going to do the next day, celebrate.
So with that, the last day after, what a wonderful thought that is. Thanks very much to all of our panelists for joining us, and please stay here for the next session.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have just heard some very insightful remarks. We have listened about the importance for seeing the Belarusian regime for what it truly is. We have listened about how incredibly valuable for the future of Belarus the Ukrainian victory will be. We have also heard that for us in the EU, for us in the Western alliances, we truly need to focus also on supporting the people of Belarus and other former countries of the Soviet Union for their societies to stand up to the dictators, to stand up to oppressors, and that those societies will be ready to respond if the right support is needed. So important messages coming from our panel. I think it lays a very great ground for the following discussions, which will also tackle very important areas about our core values, and the next session we will look particularly at a great example of democratic values translating into true action. This will be a session that is going to discuss the rapid mobilization of the Polish society after the 24th of February, after the Russian aggression, showing an example of democratic resilience. And of course, we couldn't have a better place to discuss this than Warsaw. And we do have a truly great moderator to introduce our guests and to lead the session. So I would like to invite now Ms. Greta von Susteren, who's the host of The Record at Newsmax. And Greta, if you are with us, please can you join us at the stage to invite our guests and lead the next session.
Thank you, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. Just as a short note, this is my third trip to the region. I was in Ukraine in March, and I'm enormously grateful to all of Poland. Everybody's helped these refugees, which is the subject of our panel today, is the refugees. And Ambassador, we're very proud of this ambassador. I'm an American, and this is an incredible ambassador. We're extremely proud of you, sir. And Kasia, with Warner Discovery, TVN24, I've been studying their journalism forever, and hashtag jealous of their good work. Anyway, thank you very much. All right, so we're going to begin with all that. Ambassador, let me start with you. Since February 24th, what has struck you about the refugee influx here into Poland?
Greta, thank you for coming to Poland, first and foremost. Let me share with you a Polish formulation on a banner over the railroad in Przemyśl, Poland. 3 words. Tutaj jesteście bezpieczni. Here you are safe. What an awesome message for the people of Poland to send to that Ukrainian mom with 2 kids arriving in Przemyśl at 11 p.m. at night, scared out of her wits and not knowing where she will go next. And that is a metaphor. That is a metaphor for the rapid mobilization the Polish people have done since February 24th. It reminds me as an American of the American reaction after the attack on Pearl Harbor. It reminds me of the American reaction to the Race to the Moon challenge that unleashed rapid technological revolutionary change in America. And it's happened in Poland before. It happened during the Warsaw Uprising during World War II. It happened during the Solidarity era. And now it happened in 2022 with millions of young Poles, especially young people, organizing on social media to go to one of the 8 border crossings on the Polish-Ukrainian border to pick up a refugee family. And my prediction is this, that in 20 or 30 years from now, there will be that young woman who today is organizing a clothing drive for Ukrainian refugees in Bydgoszcz or in Torun or in Wrocław, who 30 years from now will be the president-elect of Poland And she will have been informed by this year, by this moment, will be a better leader of a country that will be better situated to take on a global role thanks to this year.
Kasia, you wake up on February 23rd, 24th, of course, when it starts, and the war is about to start. You've got this huge news organization. It's got a worldwide reputation for being fair and doing, great journalism. So tell me, what did your news organization do to put the spotlight on this crisis?
Yeah, well, we have a very robust news organization. We touch lives of people in Poland, but we also now obviously are sister organization to CNN. And as the war broke, I think that on the moment in Poland, that was 4 a.m. in the morning, we started the coverage. So the first decision that we had, the first really editorial decision that we took was, we're going to Ukraine. We're sending our journalists, we're sending our people to Ukraine. We have to cover, we have to show what's going on and inform the public about the atrocities and about the war. That was our first editorial decision. Our first business decision, which has been very difficult, is we're pulling out of Russia. We had our channels in Russia, and we pulled out within 1 week. We pulled our business out of Russia within 1 week. And since then, I must say that on a TVN24, CNN Worldwide, we've been covering the war. We are true to one message. We don't want the world to forget about the heroism and about the pain and what the Ukrainian people are going through. On TVN24, from this 4 a.m. in the morning, on the day where the war broke, for the next 2 weeks, we had a special program, a special edition, where we were covering the war 24/7 without a single commercial break. We were just on the ground in Ukraine, showing what's going on, and we're still continuing.
Ambassador, you talked about how kind that sign is, and and like I said, I was in Ukraine in March, and I saw the people boarding the train, women and children mostly. There's 17.2% inflation rate in this country. I imagine this is a burden. Most of the refugees are here. This is a burden on the Polish government in that respect. How do you convince them to keep trying? How do you convince our government back home to keep helping too?
Well, Greta, capacity is a question that we all have. There was a Pew Public Opinion survey released just about a month and a half ago that showed incredibly that Polish public approval of taking in even more refugees was increasing rather than decreasing, which is an incredible, I think, statistic, and Pew is a very authoritative platform. And it's important to recognize this is a unique in history reception to a mass refugee movement. I served as ambassador in Sweden for 4 years, and Sweden is rightfully proud for having taken in 1 million refugees over 20 years. The Poles have received into this country over 6 million refugees in 7 months, and they are diffusely being taken care of, meaning family by family, apartment by apartment, rather than a national organizing place or structure for them to be in various focal points. It's completely different than any other refugee movement in history, and in the future, no refugee movement will occur without invoking the case of Poland regarding how those refugees are received. It's to me, a challenge, given the inflation rate that you mentioned. Close to 18% inflation is impacting every family. Everyone sees the energy prices. And at the same time, Greta, in my perspective, for the Polish people, this is 1939. This is another invasion, cruel invasion of Central Europe by an oppressor. And the young generation is connecting their ability to organize through iPhones, through these things. This is the way they are doing it. They are organizing on these things while invoking the memory of World War II and the Holocaust when less was done for people being oppressed. So it's a remarkable story that connects the past and the future right here in Central Europe, and it's working.
You raised the iPhone, is that we had an air raid sirens for what cities we were in. They would show up on our iPhones so we'd know, if we couldn't hear the siren. Kasia, you've got journalists inside Ukraine. How do you balance covering other stories and keeping the story of refugees alive so they don't get sort of, here in the United States, or not here, but in the United States, we can get war fatigue. We've talked about the war so much, but this is such an important story. How do you keep it so that people are interested in it every single day? Something like refugees, which could perhaps the sadness can get overwhelming, and the same story almost sort of repeats itself.
So to the point that the ambassador just made, that it's historically unique in the way how Polish people mobilized, how they opened their homes, because those refugees really entered all the individual homes of people, yes? How they opened their homes, how they opened their families, how they opened, how they felt responsible and opened their hearts. I think this is unique. It's unique for the world, it's unique for us, a very unique moment. And there's a very important role that we as a media, we feel we have to play here. And it's also about showing that and bringing and supporting that mobilization and helping with this, with maybe also a structured way. So one thing that I wanted to mention is over the weekend, just after the war broke, during the weekend, we pulled together, we set up a special website that would inform people. We got a lot of calls. We got a lot of calls from people. How can we help? How can we help? There were a lot of people going to the borders. There were a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. And we thought okay, this needs organization. We need to show, we have to put information because there's so much missing information. We need to put reliable information out as we put on the news, but also to the people, how can we help? Within 24 hours, we pulled this website. It's still working. It's still operating. We put new information where we put, organization. It's open to any organization that is providing help, credible organizations that provide help. We check how we can help from legal perspective, from aid, humanitarian perspective, any type, finding jobs, finding schools for children, and so on. So there is this place on Good Morning TVN where you can find all of that. And we believe that we also have a role to play to make sure that the world sees that. And that's why our shows, the shows that were produced by our journalists from Supervisor down in Ukraine, are being broadcast on our networks around the world and on our digital platforms around the world, reminding people of what's going on, how people are mobilizing, what it takes to really make sure that it stays top of your mind.
If I could just add to what Kasia said, because I think it's so important, the role of the private sector in responding to this crisis. And I'm just so proud as the US ambassador in Poland that so many American companies have played such an incredibly constructive role in this. Kasia and TVN have been incredibly responsive in organizing and helping, in terms of the conditions of refugees. I will add to that Google $38 million announcement when their CEO was here for refugees. Hilton Hotels, Amazon, Uber, thousands upon thousands of rides. And from a historical perspective, Greta, this is really the first time where you had an incredibly well-organized and feared military conduct an invasion in which there was a really massively diffuse response against it from people, the Ukrainian people, the Polish people, businesses jumping in, and it has managed to stop this invasion in its tracks. It's a unique and kind of precedent-setting event.
The thing that I worry about the ambassador is that everybody wants to help in the beginning, but the burden has fallen primarily for geographical reasons on this country, on Poland. And it really, talk about the private sector and they're helping it, and good for them. But the momentum has got to go on, or this honeymoon of help will end. no country can endure an influx like this. And so how do you sort of, I mean, how do you keep it going so that the people realize beyond these borders what a burden it is on this country and what a big heart this country has, so that people continue to help?
Greta, I can't give you a perfect answer to that, but let me just put it this way. I'm bullish on the Polish people and their ability to improvise, their ability to endure, and their ability to support. Is the economy perfect? No. Might we see more refugees? Possibly. But I'm absolutely convinced that there is a national ethos to do what's right for the Ukrainian people and to see things through, even if it gets harder. I hope I don't have to prove that thesis, but I'm convinced that's the case. And I'm also convinced, perhaps ironically, that today and this year will behoove the people of Poland for years to come, because they have generated an identity that is amazing in 2022 as a humanitarian superpower and doing the unexpected. The Poles could have easily closed their doors and said, we feel your pain, but we can't take you. And they did exactly the opposite. And I think we would see more of that if things get worse. I hope that doesn't happen.
Gosh, you've covered, TVN24 has covered so many important stories over history, and like I said, I've watched it. I know the great work it does. What's been the biggest challenge? Because every news story, and this one's so catastrophic. What's been the biggest challenge to cover the story?
Well, one of the things that we take very, very seriously is actually in a moment of such crisis and in a moment of fear, let's be honest, because there's obviously fear in Poland as well. There's so much misinformation that's going around, and a lot of, and we cannot obviously control what's happening in internet or what kind of misinformation is happening, but this is probably one of our biggest focuses and a very difficult thing to strive for, to make sure that we are a reliable source of fact-checked information. And we can see that, from a simple measure like viewing results, that people do turn to us to check and to have reliable information. And I think this is hugely, hugely important in a situations like that. We do it obviously on air, but we also have special services that are kind of fake news checking services like Concrete 24, where we actually disclose what is being manipulated and how to approach those information. I think that this is probably one of the biggest challenges we have to make sure that people can rely on it fully.
Could I add to that? Because fear, I think, is something that the US really wants to align with the Poles to address. What's happening in the East is scary, and we don't know what Poland will do next. But we are absolutely in the game in terms of Poland's security. We have now more than 10,000 US troops in Poland, all on Polish bases. We are helping the Poles arm with the most sophisticated military technology that one can find anywhere in the world. And we are ready now for any contingency, but also more broadly are absolutely committed to Poland when it comes to indivisible security, not just military security, but energy security, the security of democracy and so forth. We are on the cusp of a very important civil nuclear power deal here in Poland, which, if it's consummated, the US Department of Energy will place its regional center of excellence for civil nuclear power and clean energy in Poland. That will connect Polish nuclear development to the national labs that the US has all across the United States and to our best universities when it comes to the study of nuclear technology. That's the kind of meshing together that we want to do across the transom when it comes to security.
Kasia, if for some reason, as an outsider to Poland and looking at history, it almost seems like it's built into the DNA of the Poles and the history in this country to Polish people to really want to help too. historically, it's almost like this generation is ready to do this.
You're talking about bringing help, yeah? Bringing help. Yeah, I think that, well, obviously this is the best testament to what you are saying, yes? And I think that it has been a remarkable movement. And remarkable movement from every single person, but also from the organizations. And as I mentioned, you could probably talk about a lot of things. I think that one thing that's really important, and what we really wanted to also do from the beginning, is there was so much goodwill, so much heart. But I believe strongly that when you organize that and when you have those moments of media or the other organizations to organize that help, we can do so much more even. And that was something that we were putting a lot of emphasis to really support the organizations or support those that really know how to handle refugee crisis, that know how to work in war zones. Our cooperation with Polish Humanitarian Action was one of those, because we know that they know how to handle that, yes? And our goodwill alone is not gonna, coupled with their know-how, can bring a real change.
Ambassador, I'm going to give you the last word on this, but it's interesting to watch all the different nations participating and helping. It's like the world is deeply divided, but it does show the good people trying to fight together to do this. I mean, helping.
Absolutely. There's every couple of days a meeting in Rzeszów called the Community of Interest meeting, which brings together the towns and the villages and the regional government, but also the national government and international governments, all working together to generate a collective response to this. At the table is, of course, the United States, but also the UK, Australia, Switzerland, Sweden, France, and so forth. It has brought the world together around the local roots of this crisis, but giving global reach in terms of the way it is seen and the response to it.
And I might just, as my own business journalism, is that I tip my hat to all the journalists who've been covering this and
Absolutely.
Bringing the word out so that people can make reasoned, smart, compassionate decisions. So I tip my hat to TVN24 and all the other journalists over there. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Can you give applause, please, to Kasia and the ambassador?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a fascinating discussion we have just heard. Please remember to tweet, to give your reactions in social media under the hashtag WSF 2022, as I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts. And again, a great thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the words about the importance of media in showcasing the resilience and showcasing the incredible support that the Polish society has given to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian population, welcoming millions of refugees into our country. And I think very important words from the American Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, about the US commitment to support our support for Ukraine and to support Polish security, which I think is also incredibly important for our society to continue our struggle in support of Ukraine. Now, we have also heard about the role of the private sector, and this lays great ground for our next discussion, where we will be looking at the role of businesses in strengthening resilience of democratic societies. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an enormous pleasure to invite for opening remarks for this session Mr. Karan Bhatia, who is the Vice President for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google. Dear Karan, if we can invite you to the stage, please join us.
Good morning, and thank you for this incredible opportunity to be here at the Warsaw Security Forum. I'm particularly pleased to have been asked to share some thoughts on this topic leading into the panel discussion about the role of business in strengthening the resilience of democratic societies. You know, it's a topic that obviously is particularly resonant given the war in Ukraine and the role that private sector companies can play and are playing in strengthening Ukraine's resilience in sectors ranging from defense to agriculture to technology. But while Ukraine is rightfully top of mind, the question of what role business should play in strengthening democracy really isn't just limited to one country. It's a topic that's relevant to many countries, some where democracy is deeply seated and robust, and others where it's much more nascent and more fragile. It's a topic that I've given a lot of thought to over the course of my 30 years working with a variety of businesses operating globally as a lawyer, then in the US government as a trade negotiator, and then at two major American headquartered companies, General Electric, and for the past 4 years, Google, where I lead the company's government affairs and public policy team globally. My thesis to you today is that business has a fundamental and profound role to play in strengthening the resilience of democratic societies, perhaps as much or more so as any other major societal institution, academia, religious institutions, the military, or even government. But to be sustainable, the role of business in supporting democratic resilience doesn't reside in philanthropy, nor as an arm of any government's foreign policy. Rather, private sector companies contribute most when they're able to do what they do best: innovate and bring much needed goods and services to markets, invest in their employees and communities, and work to achieve their missions. In short, I believe that companies contribute to the resilience of democratic society when they focus on the 3 Ps: products, people, and principles. I want to share a few thoughts using the example of Ukraine on each of these 3. I will say that the war in Ukraine for us at Google has really been an all-of-company, top-down priority since the war began earlier this year. So let me start with the most straightforward and probably obvious way that companies contribute. They help strengthen resilience, and that's by bringing their products to market. Good products make societies more productive, they make economies stronger, and they help people live their lives better. I certainly felt this when the company I used to work for created machinery that generated electricity, transported people, or diagnosed and helped heal sick people. But I feel it even more so in the case, frankly, of Google, where the products we bring to market have a special resonance to democracy. Products like Gmail and Android help people connect. YouTube and Google for Education help students learn. Google Maps help people move around. Ads enable small business to operate, and Google Search supplies people with authoritative information to help better live their lives. Of course, it is critically important that these products be responsible, that they protect people's safety and security. In the context of Ukraine, we've taken those responsibilities very seriously. First, we sought in a time of crisis to provide good, desperately needed information into the country. Working with government authorities, we rapidly created new information products, new tools to allow Ukrainians looking for trustworthy, authoritative information about the war, about refugee resources, about routes to be able to escape, and enable them to access such information easily on the web. We've also created new technology, for example, to transmit air raid alerts to people's mobile phones in advance of hearing the siren, often giving them precious additional minutes to seek shelter. As importantly as getting good information out there, we have focused on combating disinformation. In an unprecedented step for us and going beyond what any sanctions required, we took down all Russian state-sponsored media off our platforms globally. We shut down our ads business in and to Russia because we were concerned about advertising being a possible vector for disinformation. And we've removed hundreds of YouTube channels and thousands of videos that promoted disinformation about the war. And we have deployed our products to combat growing cybersecurity risks. Google is the world's most attacked website in the world. We have had to become best in class at security to protect our own online presence. And recently, we have extended that protective umbrella to Ukraine's ministries and institutions. I can tell you from a personal perspective, it's been inspirational watching our company, like many others, spring into action following the invasion earlier this year, working 24/7 to build and evolve products to meet this extraordinary challenge and protect users. And we were so gratified when President Zelensky recognized Google with the first Ukrainian Peace Prize award granted to any private sector company. So that's products. The second area of focus I would suggest is people, employees and communities. Companies strengthen resilience when they invest in people, specifically employees and the communities they live in. Democracies thrive when people have good, fulfilling jobs and healthy, prosperous communities. For many companies, including Google, that, of course, has meant continuing to invest in the people of Ukraine. In Ukraine, and as people have been forced to flee as they move to neighboring countries. In our case, we've continued to maintain our presence in the country itself, but we have also grown our activities in neighboring countries. We have been inspired by the support that the Polish people, including many Google employees in Poland, have shown in helping refugees fleeing the war. And we felt moved to act as a company and have contributed more than $45 million in humanitarian relief. Everything from Chromebooks for kids to money to help displaced people build new lives. But perhaps as important, we've continued to demonstrate confidence in the region by continuing to invest here. Just weeks after Russian tanks rolled across the border and with the world very jittery about what would transpire in the Central and Eastern European region, we decided to expand our presence with a significant $700 million real estate investment here in Warsaw. And contrary to what some had urged, lest we make ourselves a target, we didn't do that quietly because we knew the world would be watching. And an investment of $750 million by Google would send the message that we wanted to be heard, that the global business community was not going to be intimidated, that we would continue to invest in this important region. Lastly, businesses support democratic resilience by being true to their principles, by how they do business, by setting a model of transparency and responsibility and integrity for the countries in which they operate, and by being true to their commitments and their mission. At Google, our mission is to organize the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful. It is giving people access to information, which is fundamentally, we think, a democratic mission. It empowers people. It invests them with dignity. And it is no surprise as a result that when democracy is threatened, one of the first actions one often sees is shutting down the internet. Authoritarianism doesn't sit easily with the free flow of information. We just saw this in Iran in response to protests against the regime. And there, as with Ukraine, Google has taken action to try to afford Iranian citizens ongoing access to accurate information through virtual VPN services. It bears noting, though, that access to information globally has never been more under threat than it is today. Around the world, we see an explosion of regulations and government actions that seek to limit what content internet platforms can surface, often under the threat of enormous fines or even criminal liability to our employees. We see these threats not just in classic authoritarian regimes, but even in countries that would sometimes normally deem democracies. And this is where I believe democratic governments do have a responsibility to help business. They, and in particular, Europe and the United States, need to come together. They need to align on forcibly defending companies from these threats, and they need to ensure that their own actions aren't inadvertently used to justify or facilitate anti-democratic action. So let me just close by recapping my thesis. Businesses have a profoundly important role to play in strengthening the resilience of democracies, and they can best do so by focusing on what they do best, on creating great products, on investing in people, and on remaining true to their principles. Thank you very much.
Karen, thank you very much for those remarks. Extremely important to listen about the contributions of the private sector for democratic resilience. And you did underline also the great struggle for cybersecurity when it comes to taking on that public mission of the private sector. And this is what our next panel will discuss. The panel, which will be moderated by Joanna van der Merwe, who's a privacy and protection lead, the Center for Innovation, Leiden University, and non-resident fellow of the Defense Tech Initiative at SIPA. Joanna, I invite you to the stage.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to our panel today, including those who are joining us online. My name is Joanna van der Merwe, and like he said, I'm actually a senior policy advisor now at the Leiden University. And I'd like to welcome, we have 4 brilliant panelists who'll be joining us here today to talk about how do we build resilient societies in the digital era with a specific focus on the cyber threats. And first I'd like to welcome to the stage Ms. Lucinda Creighton, who is a senior fellow with the Digital Innovation Initiative at SIPA, and was previously the former Minister for European Affairs at Ireland. She also works very closely with the Extremism Project, so we'll have some interesting discussion about that. Next, I'd like to invite Minister of Defense Hanno Pevkur from Estonia, who has previously also been Minister of Social Affairs, Minister of Justice, and Minister of Interior, so a full-rounded, holistic approach to this matter. Next, Mr. Eivind Vad Pedersen, State Secretary to the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, who's previously also been a foreign defense and political advisor, as well as worked as a diplomat at various Norwegian embassies. And finally, once again, Mr. Karan Bhatia, please join us back up on the stage to delve a little bit more deeper into what you opened for us. So, as you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February highlighted the importance of military preparedness, but it's also revealed the need to be prepared to respond to actions in a holistic way. Digital technologies have increased the breadth of what needs to be responded to in these situations, with tech enabling Russia to reach beyond just Ukraine, but also carry out disinformation campaigns in NATO member states and throughout the world, as well as cyber attacks in countries that are not actively in the war. So I'd like to start maybe with looking at, you highlighted how you've been supporting Ukraine, Mr. Bhatia, but I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into what Google has done to support the response to Russia and support and how the sanctions have impacted the way you do work and how you've supported those sanctions and changed your business for that.
Great, thank you very much. So yes, to dive in a little bit deeper into some of the things I quickly alluded to. So again, at the beginning of the war, as literally in the hours following, we basically launched an all-of-company effort to sort of identify what the key results, what the impacts were likely to be on us, and what were the steps that we needed to take, recognizing that this was really an unprecedented situation. And so four main work streams coming out of that. The first was, and I alluded to each of these briefly, but just to dive into it, the first was focusing on helping the people immediately on the ground in Ukraine. We recognized that there were going to be some amount of chaos, effectively, as you had people desperate to figure out what was going on, how to be safe, for those who needed to escape, how they could do so safely, where they could turn, where there were missing loved ones, how to actually connect with them. So the first thing we did was immediately stand up, which is our bread and butter. We know how to get information out to people. And so, but we needed to do so in local languages. And the real challenge is getting the most authoritative information. So just quickly on escape routes, it was very unclear to begin with whether these routes that were being marked, were in fact being protected or not, to what extent they were safe or not. So it involved a great deal of collaboration with the Red Cross, with government agencies, and so forth. So one significant body of work, simply getting information. The second was, from the very beginning, we recognized that this was going to be a war fought like no other war in terms of the threat of disinformation. And we saw that early on. We saw everything on our sites from simply claims that there was no war, there was no invasion, there was nothing going on, don't look here, to claims about the Ukrainian government being Nazis, this being coordinated by American or European government officials, whatever it was. And so we recognized that there was a new threat and very quickly moved in advance of sanctions, you referenced sanctions there, to take actions to deal with the disinformation challenge along the lines of what I had alluded to, removing state-sponsored media, shutting down ads, etc. I would note that disinformation challenge has continued, it has evolved, it has become very targeted around different regions of the world. The messages have varied based on where the targets are, there's segmentation on it, so it's an ongoing challenge that needs to be addressed. The third area was cybersecurity, where we saw, I think there was an initial concern about simply takedowns of entire bits of critical infrastructure. We were obviously watching for that, but we were also watching for DDoS attacks. We were watching for the kinds of other things that one sees. We have what we call a threat assessment group that conducts those reviews. We were undertaking those on an hourly basis, sharing that information with relevant government authorities. And then the last, obviously, was the humanitarian efforts that I referenced before, that from a very early sign, it was clear that we, along with many other companies, were going to need to significantly step up our acts in those regard.
Minister of Defense Pevkur, Mr. Bhatia has referenced the working relationship that had to be established with various partners. Yesterday, you were on a panel and you discussed the exercises that Estonia has been undertaking to practice responding to such crises. I'm wondering what the relationship looks like in those exercises between these tech companies that play such a vital role and obviously your public sector bodies, and what does that relationship look like, and what lessons did you learn from those exercises, and how are you developing that relationship, especially in light of lessons that are being learned in Ukraine?
Well, good morning. First of all, we have to go back in time, about 15 years. So when we go back to 2007, this was basically the first cyber attack, large-scale cyber attack to any country. The Russians then attacked Estonia, and then what we did that time was that, yes, we are lucky that we are a small country, that we were able to close basically all the lines into Estonia, and then we started to open bit by bit the gates again, and this was very simplified approach how we dealt that time with the Russian cyber attack towards Estonia. But now also giving or taking these lessons, what we saw then, we created a new system, or not a system, but new approach that in our Defense League, which is a voluntary unit in our defense system, basically we've created also, or actually it was an initiative from the private sector, to create cyber defense league, which means that those people who are involved in this kind of activities, they are still working somewhere in the companies as tech leaders or heads of IT or specific experts. And when there is a need, or if there is a need, then they will join our state experts, and we will basically make a joint task group immediately how to tackle these attacks. And this is a very good example, how you can engage the private sector towards to the attacks. Now, when we take Ukraine, then I must say for the beginning that Ukraine has been extremely successful in Stratcom. And part of that Stratcom is definitely also the digital approach, what they did, what kind of messages they are giving out, what kind of videos they are uploading to increase the defense will and all that kind of activities. And I'm very happy to see, as we have had very good cooperation with Ukrainians throughout the years. And we also shared our experience from 2007. Then they were able to prepare themselves for such kind of war and such kind of attacks, what they see at the moment in Ukraine. And definitely the Defense League or the Cyber Defense League, what we told them is one of the approaches. So also in Ukraine, we see that many private sector companies and also experts are helping at the moment in military to tackle with the cyber attacks, because cyber attacks can be very different. We heard the DDoS, but DDoS is just one of the easiest attacks. You can see also hybrid attacks in hybrid sphere. So you can see that they will publish decision makers' phones just to give people just overload of the calls. You see fake news, you see falsificated acts or papers. So it's like wide range of possibilities. But what we have to understand is that, probably alone the government sector cannot tackle all these challenges.
Thank you, and I think that leads really well into a question I have for Mr. Vad Peterson. We know that in hybrid war, we're facing a lot of threat vectors, crossover between different ones. And I was wondering, how do you view the intersection of cybersecurity and energy security given Russia's threats in both spaces? We've seen Nord Stream 2. We know that the Baltic pipeline also had to pay attention to security issues recently. What is the crossover between those two? And if anybody wants to jump in, I see Mr. Batya already nodding. If you want to jump in to add on at the end, please feel free.
Thank you. The two are obviously connected. A few years back, we had the example in the US of foreign hackers managing to infiltrate US companies in charge of a significant portion of the US electric grid. So obviously, cybersecurity, energy security have been connected for a number of years. It is a paradox, however, I believe, bearing in mind the images we saw in the Baltic Sea a few days ago, that whoever is responsible, there are more cost-effective ways of achieving the same aim, using cybersecurity, cyber tools, which again leads me to the preliminary conclusion that a major motivation of whoever is responsible was the symbolism. We've seen the images of the methane gas literally bubbling up, and with the consequences it has had for increased worries, fear across Europe. We have, of course, taken our side of the responsibility as now Europe's largest gas provider. Norwegian companies from the Norwegian shelf, 8,800 kilometers of pipelines to Europe. On the kinetic side, on the military side, with the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Home Guard, and a number of other visible and non-visible measures. But I come back to the simple fact that there are easier way of achieving the same aims, which again leads me to the preliminary conclusion that what happened there could have many motivations, one of them being us to worry about different things, steering our attention away from, for example, what's happening in Ukraine. But coming back again to the connection, energy, cybersecurity, my experience from the past week is that I'm not complacent at all, but from energy companies, they are much more used to this than to the threat posed by what we saw in the Baltic Sea. This was not a whole new world, but linking up with the military side, with the government agencies on that side, was not something that they were that used to. Handling cybersecurity threats, they are certainly used to. If you're a big company, this is something you deal with on a daily basis. So not complacency whatsoever, but luckily the companies have significant experience and expertise in how to handle this.
Just to follow up on that, has there been any change in threat perception as I know that Russia conducted some of these attacks on energy infrastructure after the 2014 annexation of Crimea? Has there been any change in threat perception based off of the change in the way, in the level of belligerence that Russia is willing to go to at this stage? You know, we're hearing them say we're going to possibly use nuclear weapons. Has there been any change in the threat perception of what Russia would be willing to do using cyber means in Europe or specifically in Norway as one of the main providers of energy security for Europe in this situation?
Keeping a cool head and taking the threat seriously, the answer nonetheless obviously would have to be yes. And it's also clear, bearing in mind, I mean, just the cost analysis of analyzing the costs of if you want to create harm, that's one of the most cost-effective way of doing things is to attack through on the digital side. So certainly, after what we saw in the Baltic Sea, threat perception has changed somewhat, and measures have been taken.
So you've mentioned, each of you touched upon in some of your answers, the discussion around disinformation, misinformation. Ms. Creighton, I'd like to talk to you a bit about a topic that may be not being highly high on the agenda, but are you worried about fomenting extremism from the Ukrainian war and what that means for misinformation, disinformation we're seeing online, and whether we have that is causing a concern that is not being taken seriously enough yet?
Yes, is the short answer. So I think, firstly, I think it's fair to say that the large tech companies have responded, as indeed have governments around the world, in terms of the immediate action of banning, RT and specific state-sponsored media outlets, and that was very swift and immediate, and I think had an important and positive effect. I suppose what's much more difficult and intangible are the multiple millions of social media accounts and different platforms where the Russian state, long before February 2022, has been building a really effective and very sophisticated disinformation presence across technology platforms. And I think that is something that has been having and continues to have a profound impact across the world, and I think particularly with a geographical focus on Europe. And that's something that the European Commission, governments across the West are very conscious of and have attempted to respond to, but it's very difficult and has, I suppose, met with mixed results. And that obviously is a heightened threat and a heightened risk since the invasion of Ukraine. I think when you look at Ukraine, so the risk here is, I suppose, you have the theatre of war, you have an attractive destination for far right and far left extremists, both of whom have traveled to Ukraine and have participated on both sides, actually, which is interesting, and across the ideological spectrum as well. And in a sense, it doesn't often matter to some of these far-right extremists or far-left extremists with whom they're aligning. So there's a huge groundswell, if you like, of extremist propaganda fueled by the conflict in Ukraine, and that has not just happened since February. It's been the case going back to 2014. We have seen recruitment campaigns online, radicalization to some extent online, and we've seen individuals now. I think it's estimated about 20,000 potential foreign fighters had declared their interest in traveling to Ukraine, most of whom would have been coordinated or inspired online through online propaganda campaigns. In reality, that number hasn't travelled to the theatre of war. It's much closer to, I think, around maybe 1,000 since February. So it's much smaller actually than the period from 2014 onwards, when about 17,000 Western foreign fighters travelled to Ukraine to participate primarily with pro-Russian forces. So it's a threat, it's a risk. I think we've learned a lot in terms of how to deal with radicalization and recruitment in the context of extremist content online and indeed terrorist content online, which emanated from the wars in Syria and Iraq. And I think some of the lessons that have been learned in those contexts now need to be applied in terms of evaluating and assessing the risk and the threat from the war in Ukraine and the risk of potential violence down the road, perhaps not immediately, but certainly it's something that policymakers and legislators need to be really, really aware of.
And from your viewpoint, would you say that reaction from the tech companies, that swift reaction at the beginning, was a result of having learned lessons from other areas where we saw this online propaganda? And would you have seen them do more, or do you think it was enough of what they were capable of?
I mean, I think not just in the context of the war in Ukraine, but if you look at elections on both sides of the Atlantic, I think a huge amount of pressure has come to bear on particularly the large tech platforms to respond, to be more responsible, to be more transparent in terms of how they actually address the big, significant problem of illegal content online. That pressure it's moral pressure, it's pressure coming from sponsors, it's pressure coming from policymakers. It's also materializing now in the form of regulation and legislation. So we've seen in the European Union in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen the terrorist content online regulation, which puts significant responsibility and burden on tech platforms. And of course, recently agreed and finalized the Digital Services Act, which again imposes really significant obligations on tech platforms around disclosing revenues from advertising, transparency around political messaging, and also, of course, requirements around the removal of extremist, illegal content and terrorist content. So a lot is happening, both from a sort of a voluntary perspective, but also from the point of view of regulation, which is obliging tech companies to respond. And I think from a reputational point of view, I think they really do want to be seen to do it, and increasingly that is the case. And I think that's partly, why we saw a fairly rapid response when it came to the invasion of Ukraine in February.
You mentioned the different laws coming out, governance structures. Mr. Bhatia, I'd like to talk to you maybe a bit about, we've got European views and the US views here, and we know that there is a move to create a more transatlantic approach to how we govern tech and the different regulations. Do you, we know that the European Union has been imposing stronger and stronger regulations. How do you view those regulations and the possible divide across the Atlantic on the ability to build truly digitally resilient societies, but also partnerships between the two?
It's a terrific point and very timely, given some of the things Lucinda and others sort of referenced. If I could just maybe comment very quickly, though, on the last point, which I think that, from my vantage point, one of the most interesting things to see having in the Ukraine context was how tech companies, or at least I can speak for Google, reacted as quickly as we did. I think it was in part due to what we had learned before from the experiences in Syria and Iraq and so forth. But I also think that there was, on some of these, there wasn't regulation. The sanctions and things had not yet kicked in to sort of dictate outcomes on the disinformation side. What I saw that was impressive was just the degree of informal, immediate coordination that was happening. So in a certain sense, it's a question of, this was outside of regulation. This was, now it may have been reputational concerns. It may be that, as in our case, you just didn't want to have disinformation on your platform. It is not the kind of platform, it's not what you want as you're looking to build the business. But what allowed the action to happen was actually a level of informal, practical coordination. People on the phone sort of saying, what about this? What about that? What about this? That, in fact, I think was an incredible model and something that we've learned from this, so that maybe to the point the minister was making, it's actually a partnership that we really need to have take this stuff on. It's no amount of regulation is going to sort of yield that result at the end of the day. It really has to be done through that level of coordination. On the point that you were making about transatlantic, yeah, I mean, look, from our vantage point, we have seen the last 10 years, unfortunately, be a period where we've actually seen less and less coordination, I would say, to some extent divergence, to some extent it's just been two ships sort of going in different directions here between the United States and Europe. The US has, in some significant measures, simply not acted at all. We've been pushing, for instance, for stronger comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States. Europe obviously acted. But more broadly, if you look globally around the world, you're seeing a proliferation of regulation in a variety of different spaces, which even for a big company like Google becomes incredibly challenging to comply with. If you are going to have to comply with 200 or 500 when you start dealing with national level privacy regulations or content regulations or whatever. It's not just a tax, it's really prohibitive for many to actually get into it. So thus the point that this, and I do think the Ukraine war is a little bit of impetus potentially for the two sides to start coming together. There's been the launch of the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, a terrific thing. We've urged it from the beginning. I'd say the results thus far are modest, good, but modest. There are much bigger things that need to be addressed, real coordination. And what is ultimately at stake, I would suggest on this, is if the US and Europe can't come together as the world's leading democracies in this space, the field is being entirely opened up to others to set the model, or simply for there to be no alignment whatsoever. So hugely important topic.
Yeah, I mean, that leads to the question of if we don't come together, do we open ourselves up to not being able to compete with China and China's model of building digital technologies?
I mean, look, I think you see a variety of countries out there that are pushing less liberal, less democratic visions of the internet, frankly, not even a globally integrated internet. So yeah, I think that's certainly a threat. And then the other threat is just simply, you've got this explosion of divergent forms of regulation. There are elements of protectionism that work their way into these things. There are elements of, authoritarianism that sort of work their ways into these forms of regulation. So yes, I think the imperative is there.
So I'd like to take a bit of a futuristic look now and look at what we need to do, where we're going with building resiliency, cyber resiliency as we move forward, especially as the geopolitical situation is changing a bit. So I'd like to start off with Minister Pevkur. What do you see going forward for Estonia, one of the leading cyber countries in the world? I mean, I would say at the forefront of it. What do you see next for Estonia and how they're building their resiliency, and maybe what can the rest of us learn from your country?
Well, you can learn many things from Estonia, for sure. Just come to visit us and we will show you. We don't have much time for that, so to go through all the details. But nevertheless, when I'm just trying to think about the future, so then first and foremost, resilience definitely is important. And our readiness to tackle all the challenges we have ahead of us. But just imagine for a moment what also the social media platforms, what role they play. Also, when we take that, what is the responsibility? For instance, let's imagine that there will be a video in Facebook circulating where the President of the United States declares nuclear bombing to Russia. It comes out that it's a deep fake, but as the deep fake is just, like evolving so rapidly that it's not so far away, and actually it's doable already today. And now when we don't have the approval to that, so even when the approval comes in 10 minutes, then by that 10 minutes, it has been circulating all around the Facebook already to millions and millions of viewers. And we can only imagine the impact to the global markets, to the economy, to the financial markets, to the decision makers, etc. So I believe that deepfake is something we have to fight very, very heavily in that matter, that it's a huge threat to the security of our people. And then this is the sad part of the story. The good part of the story is that tech industry is always inventing something new also for the military side. So even when I take my own Estonian companies like Vegvizir, who is producing the virtual reality glasses for instance, tanks. So basically, it's much more secure, and it will get more information to the operators. Or the Census Q, who is producing the intelligence gathering information from the battlefield. So that kind of new inventions will help on the battlefield a lot. But once again, when we take the technology, then we have to separate the civil side and the private sector and the military side. So it's, but on the other hand, both of the sides, especially the bad people, can use this technology against us, and especially in that sense, I truly believe that we have to be very, very careful with all these new gadgets, new things in the market or on the market. So it's a quite a big challenge for us to understand what is the fake news and what is the reality, and and also when I now bring also the third component, which is the real cyber attack to our different infrastructure objects, like power plants or whatever. Basically, everything is linked today. So when we take out and create the perfect storm in the energy sector, so then we all understand what that means to the societies. So it's a great challenge for all of us, but I believe that Estonia is one of the countries who is well prepared for that kind of attacks.
I'd like to open up to the floor if anybody has any questions in the last 10 minutes here. Are there any questions? There is a mic runner, I believe, today who will bring the microphone to you. We have one here at the front.
Thank you. My name is Greg Domber. I'm an American academic here in Poland on a Fulbright Fellowship for the year. My question is particularly to Google, but to everyone on the panel. With each passing day, the likelihood of Ukrainian victory seems more and more present. I think that's something we're all asking for and fighting for. So my question is about the day after the Ukrainian victory and how lessons from the past 7 months affect strategic thinking in terms of cyber threats, in terms of cyber response for the other panelists, but for Google in terms of investment. You spoke about investing in people and products. How has your thinking about engagement in the Russian sphere been shifted by the brutality, by the immorality, and by the actions of Russians and the Russian government in these past 7 months? Thank you.
I'm happy to take a quick stab at that. I'll talk about Russia, but let me talk about investment in Ukraine for a second as well, which is, I actually am very excited by, notwithstanding the fact that the Ukrainian government is dealing with this unbelievable challenge of the ongoing aggression, they continue to be focused on building a robust digital system for their government. And we've had the privilege of working with some of the Ukrainian government officials. Deputy Prime Minister Fedorov in particular has been a leader in sort of thinking through it. So it's a remarkably forward-sighted thought about how to construct a e-government system that in any event we're excited to be thinking about how to work with them on. I think with respect to Russia, look, the reality is that sanctions alone, I think, have made the prospect of ongoing economic engagement in Russia something that I don't think anybody is seriously thinking about. At least I will tell you our business is there, is shut down. As I mentioned before, we've shut down our ads business. We actually had to declare bankruptcy because we were having our assets sold, or assets seized by the government. So honestly, there's not a lot of thinking, I think, going on about anything in the future there.
Well, very briefly about Ukraine. So trust me, every country at the moment is looking very closely what is happening in Ukraine and trying to take the lessons learned from there. And for sure, you know, the day after will be that one thing is theory, what we think, how everything is working, but the battlefield shows clearly how they work in reality. And you know, we have seen some, or we have taken already some of the lessons of that, you know, that you think that, or everybody had an understanding that Russia's army is very advanced and then we have some new gadgets on the battlefield. The reality was different. Yes, they are using some of the possibilities, but the reality still is that they are using the same methods as they used in the Second World War. So, but nevertheless, when we take the intelligence, when we take the possibilities for the information gathering with other means, like with a satellite or with some other equipment, then definitely for the battlefield and then for the lessons learned, this is something we have to look very carefully, and we will collect a lot of information from that, and we will do our conclusions from that, and we will implement or adapt our defense plans accordingly.
From my perspective, I think the lesson learned from this experience and the approach that must be adopted the day after, and I hope that your prognosis is correct, it is that there is no alternative to the transatlantic alliance. And the United States and Europe has to face these challenges collectively. I think, you know, we've seen in the past the pivot away, the pivot to Asia in the United States. We saw in the last administration the European Union literally being deemed an enemy of the US. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think we see more clearly now than we have probably for 60 or 70 years that Europe is absolutely essential to US security and vice versa. So I think that's a really important takeaway, and it goes to your point, Karan, around the TTC. We have to make that work. The results are very modest to date, but we have to make it work. And then the other point, I think, is when we look at security and defense, generally speaking, cybersecurity is core, it is fundamental. I think still we think in old-fashioned terms about security and defense spending. When we talk about contributions to NATO, we're thinking in terms of traditional expenditure, traditional infrastructure, and I think we have to change that attitude. And when we talk about forms, you know, the regulation and legislation that's happening in Europe around tech at present, I think we have to have a greater input from, for example, cybersecurity agencies, national and European level and US. We have to actually listen to cybersecurity experts when we're framing this type of regulation to ensure that it is robust. And that's something that has shocked me actually in the last number of years as the DMA and DSA have evolved at European level, that actually cybersecurity experts and agencies have really not been part of the conversation at all. And I think that's something that we need to learn from.
We have a time for, I think, one more question. There's a lady at the back.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'm Ana from Portugal. I'm a former member of the Portuguese Parliament, lawyer, and a researcher in Cambridge University for defense and security issues. My question is for Google. Sorry, but I really want to know your politics in terms of fighting against misinformation. As a tool of research, very powerful, you passes an image of trust for the researchers that research on Google tool. So what will be your politics in terms of fighting and contribution in terms of fighting against misinformation? Because as a lawyer, I already tried to denunciate so many sites that are selling, for example, tickets, false tickets to concerts and things like that. And I don't know, I just want to know much more about that, because you will have you could have a very strong contribution to this problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. Look, as I mentioned before, I think the Ukraine war is maybe the most tangible example, but of the challenge of disinformation and misinformation in recent months. But it is a pervasive challenge. It exists not just in the context of Ukraine, and not just perpetrated by state-sponsored actors or by one government. We see, unfortunately, it growing. The elections that you referenced, I think, were an important wake-up call for a lot of technology companies in that regard, and I think there's an enormous amount of effort going into it. There are an array of ways that we try to tackle it and think about it. One is through the application of new and more technology to address the challenge. And one has to imagine the scale of the problem is almost unimaginable. You know, the hundreds of hours of video that get uploaded every second into major platforms. The fact that misinformation and disinformation is not happening just in the English language, it's happening in thousands of languages, and it's often incredibly subtle and being done with references and dog whistles and things that one doesn't fully appreciate. So one needs to invest in research to understand what the nature of the challenge is. One thing I will mention about Central and Eastern Europe specifically in the context of this is we announced a multi-million-dollar grant to invest just in this region on understanding how disinformation is being perpetrated. You know, what is the narrative that would work in any particular way? And then, of course, there is the array of tools that one has to use within the technology itself. So raising up authoritative information, taking out, reducing, adjusting the algorithms to eliminate misinformation and disinformation, utilizing business models to try and reward
authoritative information. So it is a comprehensive approach to a huge challenge. There is no single solution. There's no company that's perfect at it, I will tell you, but it is among the top challenges that we think about.
So unfortunately, that brings our time to a close. I think, as you highlighted, when we're talking about digital resiliency and cyber threats and opportunities, we could talk for hours because it is all-encompassing and it is a massive challenge we face going forward. I'd like to thank each of the panelists for joining us today. Very interesting conversation and brilliant insights. Maybe I'll come visit Estonia so that I can learn a bit more about it from you. And thank you to the audience and the people who have submitted their questions.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for this very important and interesting discussion on how to address the cyber threats for democratic resilience and how to build on opportunities in this area. Ladies and gentlemen, as we progress with the democratic resilience track at the Warsaw Security Forum 2022, we will be faced with a very important question, which I think all of us have somehow in the back of our heads when we're having all the discussions in this great event. And that is, can the international rule-based order be saved? Is there a way to continue it for peaceful means? And in order to tackle this very important question, we have a special guest today, and the special guest will be interviewed and will be introduced by a great friend of the Warsaw Security Forum, the president of the Center for International Relations, Ms. Małgorzata Bonikowska. Małgosia, please join us on the stage.
Thank you. Good morning. We know that we don't have much time. We are slightly late, but I hope it will be an interesting conversation. First of all, welcome Cathy Ashton, Lady Ashton. I don't need to introduce her to the Polish audience and to the international audience here. British politician, a European politician, former High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Policy and Defense Policy. Also Commissioner for Trade earlier, and now still House of Lords and academician, active in the academic field, fellow in Woodrow Wilson Center. Well, a lot of all these titles, but then that's the reason why we can confront this very difficult topic we are having, and we are grateful for the organizers also to jointly do this session with my center, Center for International Relations, because we, political scientists, we put these questions to ourselves all the time. What is happening? Where are we in this global disorder? So, Cathy, how do you feel now, being a person who was responsible, at least partly, for the foreign affairs in the European Union, when we have such a different world now because the war happened in war? What's your feeling about the world order?
So I think we need to be careful in not allowing Russia to not only create this dreadful war with Ukraine, but also allow them to upend and change what we know to be true, which is an order based on rules that are based on our commitments to democracy and freedom and human rights, are fundamental and core to the way that we want to organize ourselves. And the organizations like the UN that if you like, are trying to build the structures that enable us to promote those values, are valuable not just with the Security Council, and I appreciate how difficult the future of the Security Council is, but for particularly smaller states who have opportunities through the UN to raise the concerns that they have, and we shouldn't want to lose that.
But let me jump on that, because we just faced a situation where a powerful country like Russia just questioned all that. It questioned, Putin and generally the Russian Federation questioned the international order, rule-based order, the role of the international law, because it's broken, the international organizations even. So do you think, is it possible to keep this order going? Or it's just a wishful thinking, it will not happen because it's a beginning of something much worse?
So Russia has decided that it wants to have a different order. For those of you who are interested, there's a really good article on this by Sergei Lavrov written last November, where he asks the question, why should we follow the United States and the West view of what an international order should be? What about other nations, other approaches? But they may choose to ignore what they have signed up to and been part of. That does not mean that we should say, in that case, it is broken. And actually, one of the things that has been reassuring to that extent has been the commitment of European nations, the strength of the Ukrainian people, the determination that we see across the United States and elsewhere, many countries across the world, who have said, we do not recognize what Russia has done, we will not support this war, we will support those who are trying to defeat the war and prevent this reality from changing, so that Ukraine ends up as a nation free and determined of itself to be the country facing the directions it wants to face. And I think it is the response that tells us that there's still opportunity for the international order to, if you like, pick itself up a bit, brush itself down, and keep moving forward with the commitments that it makes to the values that we hold.
Well, I understand this approach that we, back Ukraine not only because of Ukrainians, but also because we believe in the world based on rules, international laws, that we just can't accept such a move, like invasion. But do you think the world, generally speaking, we are talking really about global issues, is going to keep peace, or that war is just a signal that, there's no more possibility of peacefully cooperate because countries, especially powerful countries, not only Russia, China, maybe some other newcomers, would question everything, and peacefully we can't resolve it?
Well, the world is an incredibly turbulent place, and one of the things that I think we have to recognize, and I say this from having been the chair of the Foreign Affairs Council with the then 28 countries of the EU, now 27, is to listen more carefully to those who know. One of the things that I remember very consistently were Polish foreign ministers, Baltic foreign ministers, consistently and determinedly saying there is going to be a problem from the East, that Russia is a much more dangerous country than we believe it to be. And we have to learn both to be more vigilant, to listen more carefully to those who see the signals and the signs that things are changing. And in terms of thinking more strategically about countries like China, we need a strategy. We have a lot of tactics, but we don't seem to have a strategy.
As European Union.
We as European Union, I think actually it's hard to find countries that do have a strategy towards China, because there's a huge amount of economic interdependence that goes on. There's a huge amount of political concern about what's happening with China, and somehow we don't seem to have built together a collaborative approach that says, okay, this is how we're going to look at China for the next years. Now, I know within the EU there's been a lot of work done on this, so I'm not being critical at all of anyone. I just simply think that if we learn anything, we're going to have to look After this is all over, all of the lessons that need not only to be learned, but to be implemented, one of them will be that.
But let me push you a little bit about that, because you said when this will be over, but maybe it will not be over. Maybe it will not be over soon. Maybe it will be even worse. Who knows? We are all worried that the time comes that stability is finished. Now it's permanent instability, and this can be a first war. Maybe there will be more wars, proxy wars, how we call it. Maybe we are facing a new Cold War, or like some political scientists name it, Cold War 2.0.
All of these possibilities, and it's depressing for us, but my goodness, what it must feel like for people in Ukraine who are thinking about where this could go. We have to be absolutely clear in our objectives, which is to help the people of Ukraine to win. We have to be absolutely clear in our objectives of what kind of European architecture, as we call it, for security we're going to create. We have to be absolutely clear in our objectives about what the relationships in 20 years' time will be with Russia, whether we're able to support countries like Georgia and Moldova to make sure they too have the opportunities to tackle the problems of those who have taken their space, and of course for the people of Belarus. So there's a huge amount of work to be done that is in part about how we support militarily, in part about how we support politically, but in part too about building the coalitions across the world that can help us come up with some of the answers, but also determine how the architecture is going to move forward. Because actually, that's going to be the best option in the end, is to create the architecture for the next 100 years, not the next 50 years.
Well, that's easier to say than to do it. Of course, we have our own internal issues within the European Union. Well, your country just, did Brexit, which didn't help. So to be a little bit more even pushy, again, I want to ask you about the future, because we also discussed the shape of this international order. And now we have, well, we used to have unilateral world when basically Americans really kept the things going, kept the globalization going as well. But it seems like finished. This phase is finished. We hope that multilateral world will be able to be kept, especially for Europe. But what about bipolar perspective, which is also a possibility from the American side? China is a major rival. Americans push Europeans to have a clear stand. What is your perception? What will be the evolution of this?
So let me start with what I call tankers and yachts. That on the sea, the tankers can stay at sea a long time. They're difficult to maneuver, but they keep going. They are heavy, they are grounded, they know where they're going and what they're trying to do. The EU is a tanker, the UN is a tanker, NATO is a tanker. And then you have the yachts. And the yachts can move quickly, they can go at great speed, but they don't stay at sea very long, and they're often going from one place to another. They're not trying to continue their journey. They are the coalitions, if you like, the things we put together that are not based on the depth of values and ideals. You don't sign up to the constitutions or the rules. You're simply brought together to try and solve a problem. And one of the things that I observe, and this is, in my view, partly about my own country, is that we get involved with lots of yachts. We're less involved with the tankers. And it's the tankers that we have to build and keep at sea, because although they get buffeted, although things can be very difficult, they do keep going. And all of this terrible time that we are living through, and especially, as I say, for the people of Ukraine, but I'm conscious of just how close all of this is and the contribution of the people of Poland and other nations closer to Ukraine. However bad this feels, it is not forever, one way or the other. In other words, we have to keep moving with the tankers, not dismantle them, not see them as being like yachts. And we have to be sure that though the yachts are useful, that they can be about solving a particular problem, they will not survive in the long term because they're not based on the rules and the values that really make the difference when you have to come together. However challenging the EU is, and I chaired meetings for 5 years of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Councils, so I have some experience of that. However challenging it is, it always kind of gets there. Maybe it takes longer, maybe it does it a bit too much in public so everybody knows what everybody thinks, ambassadors briefing all the time, but it gets there because the purpose of the organisation is to find an answer. And that's where tankers really come in. Their job is to find solutions, not to just have problems. So you need both, but I'm more worried now that we're not spending enough time on building and securing the tankers. We're too busy having yachts to deal with a few problems, and we need more tankers.
So at that moment, I would like to ask you a little bit more about powers, because, you know, that's also what we hear, that the rules, international law, is not anymore so, you know, so well protected, because there are, again, countries who use power to break it. They just don't care, like Russia did with Ukraine. Its invasion is a breaking of international law, and Russia did it. So we say maybe we are back to the game of powers, that it's not anymore, you know, so much important what are the laws. There will be an importance of power, and the power projection will be more often seen. Is this what you think we can expect?
Well, power projection's always been a factor in every aspect of foreign policy. It's also been a reason to build the coalitions and to strengthen them, because it's the vulnerable countries who often suffer. And these are all about people whose lives get ripped to pieces and torn apart because of the desire of another nation. And the protection for them lies in the strength of the coalitions that are built. And it really matters. It matters on everything. It matters on climate change when you look at what's happening to small island states who don't have the voice and don't have the power projection, that they need to both come together as a group, as a yacht, but they also need the tankers to be prepared to support them. And it really is important that we don't get caught up in looking simply at saying, because Russia has done what it's done, because Putin's Russia has behaved like this, that somehow everything else is no longer valid. Quite the opposite. This shows us how important it is to keep the rules-based organizations and to be determined that our values will win out.
One more question concerning this world order. Do you believe that we need something new in that? Because you use this comparison with tankers, but what about new organizations maybe? What about, you know, well, UN was also created as a reaction on the war. Do you think what we have is enough to keep this world peaceful, or we need something else?
There is no issue that we could think of here or in any forum that any nation can resolve by itself. From the pandemic to economic security to, of course, defense, nothing. So everything has to be done in some form of collaboration with someone else. Everything. You can't look after your population as a government on your own. So everything has got to be thought of in that context. Now, if you're thinking about, do we need to create more organizations? I'm not sure. I'm not sure we need more organizations. If you're saying, do we need to strengthen them? I think there is an argument for looking again at whether we've made them as effective as they possibly can be. And if we're thinking about how do we go forward, I would say that it's worth examining all of these interconnections that we have and looking at whether we've currently got the right mechanisms to do it. Because you've got these interesting hybrid organizations, of which the work on climate change was one, the EU 3 plus 3, the P5 plus 1, whichever, it's 6 either way, of nations who came together on the Iran negotiations. These were kind of strange hybrids because they had the power behind them of the UN and support, but they were operating as a kind of one-off mechanism. And so creating ways in which you use the power of the rules-based organizations, but use it more creatively, will probably be something that we have to think about more carefully in the future. But I'm not convinced we need to start creating new organizations, because all we're going to do is run into all of the problems that we've currently got. And I'm not at all of the view that we want to see the world split into two big groups who face each other. I think the more we can try and hold as much as we can to the rules-based organizations we've got, the better we'll be in the future.
Well, that sounds very reasonable, of course, but I have a question inside my own, heart. If everybody on this earth thinks logically, look at Putin. Everybody was thinking this invasion wouldn't happen because it doesn't make sense. But it happened, so we cannot be sure that everybody would, be so rational. And my question will be about the West now, because all this world order was created in a way by us, by Western world after the Second World War, then especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you rightly said Russia just questions all that. Not only Russia. We have China also who is not happy with this. We have India who for years wants to be a member of Security Council of the UN. It doesn't happen. So generally Asian countries, African countries, Latin America maybe don't feel equally represented. And we have, in a way, newcomers like informal organizations like G7, G20. They are not formal organizations, but they exist because of the incapacity of organizations like UN to deliver. So what, in your opinion, what could be in 20 years to come, 30 years to come, the role of the West in such a complex, difficult, and changed world where the countries from Asia, Africa, Latin America want to speak up and want to organize this world the way they want it, not the way we want it?
It's a really big question. And I would say this. I would say that the point about the organizations that were created, whoever created them, was that we based them on, in a world that had been torn apart, the principles that we believed to be true. That we wanted a democratic future for people, that we wanted to see human rights at the core of what we did, that we wanted the values we espoused and all of the elements that build the kind of democratic societies that we believe in, civil society and so on. All of that remains the case now. It remains true. It's not about compromising that into somebody else's view of the world, but it is also about trying to build organizations that can bring in nations who do not necessarily share all that we do by a long way, but with whom we can start to build relationships and try and at least influence where they go forward. And I just think we have to keep going. We have to look at reform.
It's a very British approach.
Very British, I know, but it's a classic
Keep
British
calm
thing.
and carry on.
When in doubt, just keep going. But it served me reasonably well. And keeping going and not giving in, not being prepared to say, we can't do this, it's too difficult, but keep going and being prepared to continue to promote the values we hold, while recognizing that maybe that does mean the organizations have to be tweaked, be changed, be reformed, whatever words you like. But what it does not mean is that we, A, got it wrong, because we didn't, and B, that we need to start again and build something different, because that would be incredibly complicated, and I think we would end up losing so much of the things that we hold dear.
Thank you very much. Catherine Ashton, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just warm applause for our speaker. Thank you very much for this talk. We have to stop here because the time is flashing.
Much, Baroness Ashton, Małgorzata Bonikowska. I will now invite Alina Inaye from the German Marshall Fund of the United States to lead the next session of the Democratic Resilience Track, Protecting Democratic Election from Malign Actors and the Power of Algorithm. Alina, please join us on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for still being here with us. It's not an easy conversation that we are going to have, although the title seems to be extremely specific and clear. We've been trying to dig a little bit into what it is that we want to talk when we were in the green room. And as I said, the conversation could last for 3 hours or could last for the 45 minutes that we were assigned, and we went for the second choice. So we'll keep it as crisp as possible. And I have 4 wonderful speakers with me to help lead the conversation, who are not only extremely knowledgeable, but they are also very, very disciplined when it comes to time. And we'll start a little bit with the very title of the session, which is extremely specific. As I was saying, it refers to elections, it refers to malign interference, and it refers to algorithms. And I will turn to John to help us explain a little bit the title. Malign interference, is it only external? Is it only elections? What do we do about respecting freedom, respecting democracy, yet still limiting the malign influence, interference?
Thank you, Alina, and thank you to the Warsaw Security Forum. What a pleasure to be here with such a great group. So when I read the title, I found myself thinking, what's the problem we want to look at here? Because when framed in that way, and sometimes I feel like the discussion looks to me like it's a concern about the weeks leading up to an election in which social media platforms are used, usually to confuse voters. But I feel like we know now at this point, this began probably in 2014, frankly here in Ukraine. 2016, we know this is part of a much broader effort of global authoritarian malign influence. It's not just algorithms. I'd like to talk about algorithms, but it's also about media content sharing arrangements all around the country, all around the world. It's also about the use of oligarchs and kleptocratic resources that are being stored in democratic financial institutions and used to exert influence on political elections in Europe, in the United States, but then again also in places like Brazil, in the Philippines, where we see these issues coming. So I think we have to recognize that the algorithms piece is one toolkit, and I'll leave you with one data point, and I'll turn you there, that really struck me. Some of the folks I think who do some of the best work is Graphika. And Graphika has a report about the 2016 US election that shows, indeed, in the weeks leading up to the election, there were some 6 million bots, fake news, conspiracy theory links. 4 months later, there were nearly 5 million still. This is a much broader pattern. And I'll stop there because I do want to get into algorithms, but I don't want us to lose sight of the bigger problem of sort of malign influence upon democratic elections. Of course, it's a problem at home. The research shows that indeed, much of this information comes from domestic sources as well. But I think that we really have to sort of situate it broader, or it's really easy to get lost in a kind of technological discussion that misses, I think, the issues of the democracy dimensions that we should be talking about.
So if we are talking about algorithms, maybe I should turn to Martin and ask you, are algorithms enough to safeguard freedom of speech, but also to limit malign influences? And are they usable? Is there anything else we should be using, people should be using, or who should be using behind and besides algorithms?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I would just very shortly just like to quote John, that algorithms are just one element of the whole puzzle. But of course, they can be helpful or harmful, like anything. They are a tool. So definitely there's work to be done to improve the way algorithms, which, you know, we know that they are a huge part of our online experience. with the amount of content, especially user-generated content, that is basically being produced every day. Without algorithms, we would be swimming in a completely chaotic sea, and the internet would be unusable. So yes, algorithms play a role, and they can be improved. And we have done this over the years. We just spoke before the panel that a lot has been changing, especially since, let's say, 10 years ago. And one of these things that we've been doing is moving away from an algorithm. I'm talking very generally here, moving away from an algorithm that is a pure representation of what's out there and what people are looking at, for example, which was the way it was initially, to one that is heavily taking into account the quality of information, and the reliability of the source where it comes from. So a lot more is being placed on who is talking in terms of both quality, and these are, of course, mostly traditional, and in large part, traditional media organizations, but also the transparency angle, so you can see who is talking. And if you look at the trust project we're running with some media organization, that is an important element. So we both, we know who's talking, and these people are identified, and the algorithm surfaces these sources that are verified and quality and helpful, and not just popular. So there is definitely a lot to be done, and there is work being done, but that's definitely not going to just solve the problem in itself, especially depending on the kind of social media. Sometimes the users have a very heavy influence on what is being shared, and no algorithm will help you if the people really want to share this kind of content.
Let's be a little more specific and talk about elections coming up in November, the midterm elections coming up in the States, elections that we just recently held in Italy and in other parts of Europe, but focusing a little bit on the US. Carl, do you think that both Russia and China, let's be even more specific now, will succeed in having an interference in the upcoming elections? And is there any way that through the social media or the social media should be disciplined in order to minimize this influence?
Yeah, I think the answer to the direct question is, of course. I mean, we've seen the evidence of this previously in previous elections, and it's not just the US, it's all over Europe. I take exactly what John was saying, which is this is just one tool in the toolbox for malign influence and for the destabilization of democratic regimes. But I think we have to ask ourselves, why is this the tool of choice for a lot of these authoritarian regimes? Why do they invest so much in it? I mean, take a country like Bulgaria, which has just had elections recently, and in Bulgaria, we know that there are strong links with Russia. There have been offline Russian influence operations around pipelines for many, many years, decades now, for example. These are the kind of classic subversion techniques, I would say, influence techniques. But also the Kremlin invests something like 200 to 300 billion per year on Facebook advertising in Bulgaria. And you can tell the effects of that right now. Bulgaria has had, effectively, its oil and gas supplies cut off unilaterally by Gazprom and the Kremlin. And yet the amount of support online for Russia expressed by the Bulgarian population is amazing. It's particularly important because 70% of the Bulgarian population get their news from Facebook. Yeah, and I think this is why there is a specific responsibility for these platforms, because they are now the town hall. They are the agora for these public debates, not just in countries where, say, Facebook is the internet, like Myanmar or large parts of Africa, but even in a country like Bulgaria. So I think there's specific responsibilities. We have to look at why it's so attractive to authoritarian regimes. And I think a lot of that is around the business model, around the micro-targeting that these platforms use. This is a holy grail to anybody who's involved in political influence campaign, that you can create a kind of digital clone, a model of somebody, a model that people aren't even aware of, and you can influence aspects of their choice and behavior in ways that they are only dimly aware of and aren't labeled as political advertising. You know, for dark ops, for political influence, this is amazing. And I think so we need to, there's a lot we can talk about transparency of algorithms and so forth, that's downstream. I think we also need to look upstream at the way that these platforms collect data, make these models using data that we haven't given them. It's often inferred data, and then they essentially sell that to the highest bidder.
So again, in order to minimize the influence through the social media, through the platforms, what should be the rules? Brussels is trying to put out some rules in order to discipline this a little bit. Are these efforts so far enough? Are these rules enough? Should there be something else, Nadia?
I think it's a process, and because the technology, the internet evolves, we will have to think of the further ways to address the rising challenges that come with the use of algorithms, with the maybe the reasons why authoritarian regimes are trying to influence, manipulate information in the public sphere. So I think that the constant process of improvement, of addressing these threats in a relevant, meaningful, and timely manner will continue to be the case. So what has been done so far, for me, it's just part of this process. We see the adoption of the Digital Services Act, Markets Act, the updated Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is not a directive, it's not it's more of a kind of self-regulatory for the companies, but we do have now more companies, we do have more platforms, we have more actors signing the code, and that is kind of sharing the responsibility and making sure that the wider ecosystem is involved in addressing these challenges. So what Brussels does, we also have to come back, it's what the member states also make it possible for Brussels to legislate on in many ways. So it's also in the interest of the democracies of the member states that do show that they do care and that they acknowledge that these are rising challenges that must be addressed to defend democracy or ensure the protection of the democratic values, the rights of freedoms of expression and gatherings, etc. But what more could be done, I think, is actually on this front of what has been mentioned a little bit on the front of transparency and accountability. The fact that we do not have, or certain companies, social media platforms, giants, are still restricting the access to the algorithms, to the ways of how the ecosystem works, how are these messages spread, how are they financed, the financing of this, what is allowed, the scale, the magnitude, the frequency of all of this matters in order to make the right regulations to engage in this debate in really tailored way. So we don't kind of swim in the pool of the quantity of information trying to find the right way, but we actually do have more of a coordinated, cooperative, and therefore more effective way to counter the spread of this information. So I do think there is definitely much more to do, not only by Brussels, definitely by democracies themselves, but beyond that, it's not only, I think, the responsibility of the states. We need to engage the wider stakeholders groups like the civil society, academia, the media companies. I mean, the whole fact that it's also the media companies that sometimes share this information that come from the social media platforms. It's a circular kind of system, and we need to engage more actors, advertising companies, marketing companies, as you said, personalities, influencers, also individual private people. We see it now, maybe we'll discuss further as well, have now rising power in the public sphere. So we need to also consider that there are more actors that need to play a role, and therefore this ecosystem is something that we need to engage those actors as well.
I mean, I'd like to echo that point very, very strongly about bringing more people into the investigation of these algorithms, right? I mean, there's a proposal on the table from the European Commission that would give regulators access, but I think there has to be access for independent academics, civil society for this data as well, because again, this is just about applying standards that are in other sectors to these big platforms. For example, there has long been the principle that if your product creates safety risks, it needs to be independently inspected and verified. And I think we're just asking that in this case, where there are risks to our democracy, to some of the most precious things that we have, that these things can be independently verified. And one example of that is, for example, we all feel the effects of the kind of content moderation algorithms in our Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds. Why don't we know exactly how these work, and there should be more interoperability. We should be able to choose between different content moderation systems. The sort of resistance of companies to these kind of, I think, very simple measures is a little incomprehensible.
Thank you. If I can, I'd love to build on some of these points. To me, it seems that there are two dimensions to this challenge that we should and can identify. I mean, the first is really sort of the defensive agenda, countering malign influence from outside on our countries. And on this, I would certainly think very clearly that it's not that engaging civil society is important, because in fact it is civil society that is often the organizations that are out there identifying, advocating, raising, and speaking up on these issues. It's independent journalists, in some places, in some very risky places who merit our support and our protection. But the other, if we're just playing defense, it's not going to get us anywhere. The question is, how can we have a proactive agenda that advances the democratic principles, the principles of transparency, of accountability? And how can we recognize that there was Ron Diebert of Citizen Lab in Toronto has written some really compelling work that warns that even that basic business model that you talked about is one that is in many ways more aligned with authoritarian values. Their values, it's about monitoring, surveillance, and manipulation. But how do we respond to that in a way that is true to the democratic values that, frankly, I think are going to be the key to the democratic success? How do we recognize what is the relationship with the private sector, which will remain the private sector? And how do we then come up with a process as well that engages really our strengths of these kind of bottom-up approaches that authoritarian regimes lack? Where vibrant civil societies that can play that role and advocate and respond both sides of this agenda.
There always is this tension between democracy and the extent of freedom of speech, and the fear of encroaching about this freedom of speech when you come up with any sort of regulation, any sort of censorship, even self-censorship to a certain extent. It's obviously much easier in countries like China and Russia, where they just cut off the internet, hence there is no problem. We cannot do this. We are democratic. We operate in democratic societies. So, however you look at this question always comes up to my, to my mind, and to a lot of people's mind. Isn't this, stepping it into my own personal liberties and freedom? So again, coming back now to the company part of it, or to the company perspective on this, are there ways that the companies, that big platforms can behave differently, still ensuring freedom of speech, yet still limiting interference, malign interference? Well, interference.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest question. And one that is a bit of both a thin line to walk and also a bit of a moving line to hit. And we've been talking about how these policies have changed over time already. I'd just like to quickly touch upon what Carl and Nadia said. Some of these, I completely agree with the way you propose we move, and a lot of this stuff, at least I cannot speak for all the platforms, but if you look at what we're doing, transparency, you have the electoral ads transparency register where you can see the ad, you can see who paid for it, you can see how many times it was viewed, you can see how it was targeted, and the targeting has been very limited. For electoral, for political issues, you can only target by general location, age and gender. So it's very limited. There's no way of micro-targeting people by, especially sensitive data. So a lot of this stuff has already been done. At least, like I said, I cannot speak for any other platform, but at least as far as Google goes, I completely agree with what you said, and I think we are mostly there. We are signatories of the code you mentioned on disinformation and many other things, and there is the regulation on political advertising also coming, which to a large extent, I think we're already compliant even before it's been enacted. But the question you're saying is actually quite pertinent to this regulation as well, because one of the biggest issues is how do you define a political speech? Like, what issues are political? Because once we start regulating this part, like, where is the line? What issues are to be considered, is environment political? You could argue it is, right? Is science political? Science has become political in recent years, to my surprise. So I think the balance between freedom of speech, and we said before the panel, no medium is completely transparent. So there's always some sort of noise introduced into the system by the medium that's being used, but we do have to. I do see personally that there is sometimes voices that go a little bit too far. People claim something to be disinformation just because it disagrees with their worldview, right? So there is a very difficult, and we as platforms, we as the medium must be super careful about this. I mean, this is a great responsibility. Of course, we have a responsibility to protect democracy, as Carl said, as corporate citizens. I think no one is denying that. But on the other hand, the freedom of speech angle is also very important, especially us coming from the US with First Amendment, and we're very, very attached to the whole openness of the internet and of our platforms, which is generally a massive, I think, a great boon to society. So in keeping the core of freedom of speech, we do have to try and limit as much as we can, of course, acknowledging that we can never eradicate everything, but through transparency, through responsible policies, and through cooperation, like was just mentioned ago, I think we can at least limit. We have some metrics like that on YouTube, the views from infringing content should not be more than 0.5%. Right? So we should have realistic goals, and I think we can definitely make good progress, but try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater as well.
Some may argue, and I tend to agree with them, that we can have the most perfect regulations, and we can have the most understanding and disciplined and well-intended, platforms. Yet, as long as there is something missing, this will not work. And that's something, we talked a little bit about this earlier, Martin, in the room, and that something is education, personal education, the way each one of us approach the platforms, use the platforms, the way each one of us are able or not able, or willing or not willing to discern information and fake information. And I'm coming to you, Nadia, from where you sit in Brussels, from what you're looking at European Commission and everything that's being done in the direction of limiting malign interference. Do you think there is enough effort being put on education as well?
I think there is actually a lot of effort put to media literacy, digital literacy. There is a rising awareness building whole system and investments into this across different member states. There is a media literacy day or few days per year. I think the Commission has been in lead of that. Civil society as well has been increasing the number of the trainings. And I think education will and always is useful to enhance, to counter, or be able to be resilient to disinformation. But one of the main issues is that it's not that sometimes people don't understand or don't recognize something being manipulated or being it falsehood or just disinformation to a certain extent. They will still spread it further because it does somehow support their beliefs, or they want to have this message out for whatever reason. So the education is only part of the puzzle to solve this. And I think coming back on the idea of like the political communication and how like what role is science now, political and every other domain. The idea is not necessarily focusing so much on the content, because we do have freedom of speech, opinions. People will be finding a way of sharing their views. It's more about the reach and the speed and the scale of spreading those messages, which are not only happening in the social media space, it's also through emails and other tools and applications. So I think some of you, and this is a very valid point, it's not only about freedom of speech, but also is it about freedom of reach? Is the freedom of reach deserving the same rights as freedom of speech? And then we also have heard several times Commissioner Věra Jourová, who has also stated that the rules that apply offline should also apply online. So why should we have different rules for these spaces? I mean, we can debate how to address those things, but there is absolutely the role of education, putting also the responsibility on the consumers, on the citizens, let's say the users of the social media platforms, but let's be realistic here and see who has the real accountability and the real power to adjust these kind of behavioral patterns, the algorithms, but also the other ways of amplifications of those narratives. And here we have the other major actors, such as social media companies, such as the state regulators, such as the advertising companies, marketing companies. So it's also about how to protect the people's private data, because a lot of this information that is being then used further, sold, as you mentioned, to the companies, is actually like to marketing companies that have the phone numbers. We saw it in 2018 elections in Brazil. They were so-called WhatsApp elections. And why were there WhatsApp elections? Because there were thousands of messages which were able to be spread to huge groups of WhatsApp consumers. These are encrypted messages, so it's very difficult to also expose, to kind of intervene into this process. And the data, the phone numbers that were gathered by the companies were received and purchased from other companies that had access to it. So afterwards, one of the measures was to actually not allow this type of selling and purchases of the private information. There has been limit put on the number of the groups and the messages that you can spread in one go across WhatsApp or other applications. So there have been measures since, but we have seen that even in the elections last weekend. Of course, there was a lot of reference in Brazil to the previous elections 4 years ago, the WhatsApp elections. I mean, some things changed, many of things stay the same, because you have seen only certain restrictions being implemented. So we also speak about this kind of encrypted, more closed groups, which are extremely used for also the spread of this information. So how do we address those?
I want to take the conversation a little bit further, because we've been talking about malign interference, we've been talking about disinformation, but there is another, it's not only another term that is being used, but there is another reality which is being inflicted upon us, which is psychological warfare. We are beyond disinformation, we are beyond fake news, we are, well, even beyond malign interference. We are in the middle of a psychological warfare. And I'm coming back to what you said earlier, Glenn, that, John, sorry, that it's not enough to be defensive. So what do you mean by that? How can it be offensive? How can it be offensive when we are in the middle of, or the victims of psychological war?
So it's a really important point here. And I actually think it brings us to one of the conversations we've been having throughout these 2 days, which is Ukraine. Alongside Russia's unprovoked military invasion, it has been using the tools of information warfare alongside it. And what's been really interesting is it's not hard to read folks saying that Ukraine seems to be winning the information war, actually. And it's because they've had 8 years since 2014 to be learning the lessons. Suddenly these new phrases that we hear about pre-buttles, this effort of civil society groups to cooperate happened so quickly. But I tell you, the reason I think it's important, and the reason I pulled my notes out here, is because in this early era, when we're talking in some ways around issues around science, it can sound like, and the response is about fact-checking. Is it true something is not true? But when we get in this situation, it's different. And I want to read, just quote one sentence here, but I was struck last week listening to Tim Snyder talk about the referenda that were being sham referenda in the republics of Ukraine there, and he said, the way Russian electoral propaganda works is to tell a lie that everyone knows is a lie, and then to show by force that there is no alternative to living as though the lie were true. And I think this is when we get in the sort of incredibly difficult moment in which it's not just enough to say, oh, we'll just show that that's not true. We'll just fact check it. We'll just teach people to recognize falsehoods. And that's why I think there, and I actually think though that in Ukraine, it's difficult in some ways to say far, this conflict isn't over, but we're seeing an acceleration of learning in the information space that I think we have a lot to learn from.
Carl, your organization, the organization you represent, works in a lot of difficult societies, I would say. First of all, how do you deal with everything, with the psychological warfare, with informational warfare in these societies? How do you help societies deal with this informational warfare? And what do you think would be, if there would be one, is there a golden bullet that could solve, silver bullet that could solve the problems of all these societies when it comes to informational warfare? We know exactly who the actors are, so it's, at least that it's easy.
Well, indeed, we are very active in lots of very challenging environments, as I think the euphemism goes, and I think we've been in the business long enough to know that there are no silver bullets when it comes to questions like promotion of democracy and human rights, right? But what I will say is that the situation is very different in, I would say, mature democracies than it is in some of the most vulnerable regions in the world. What I said before is that for some regions, we saw it in the Rohingya massacre in Myanmar, Facebook, Meta, is the internet. This is, how people access the internet, right? And so, and it's even worse than that, because there are understandable pressures on companies like Meta in their home jurisdictions like the US to clean up their act ahead of the midterm elections and the presidential elections. But they don't really invest the same in other, they invest very aggressively in these regions in terms of their business, but they don't invest the same in terms of the kind of basic safeguards you would expect. So one very critical fact here, right, is that even though only 9% of Meta's users speak English, 90% of their investments in content moderation are in the English language, right? So if you then look at what's been happening in India, for example, where exactly this kind of psychological warfare takes place, are psychological influence techniques, I would say, because let's go back to the original business model. You're building a psychological profile of somebody, and you are trying to not deal in arguments, but you're trying to manipulate their emotional reactions. And there aren't even very basic standards of transparency around this. I realize that some platforms have gone to greater lengths than others in this respect. But again, just to take another example from a recent US election, there were lots of videos going around, viral videos going around, supposedly showing France or the Netherlands under Sharia law, pictures of the Mona Lisa in a burqa, for example. Now, these weren't labeled as political content, but they were targeted at people whose fears were about migration, and they were intended to support the candidate who was going to purportedly do something about Muslim migration to the US, right? Now, we only know that this was actually paid for by a super PAC by the Trump campaign at the time because of a mistake in the accounting firm who actually accidentally released this detail into the public domain, right? So this is so far from basic standards of transparency that apply offline. We really need to up our game on this, and I think this is absolutely critical. And I think some of the things that are being done in Brussels now in political advertising transparency will help, but I think there needs to be a lot more done.
We have about 3 minutes before we lose one of the speakers. So if there is a question, or if there are 2 questions from the room, we could take them. And I cannot see anything. Yes, good. Yeah, the gentleman in the 3rd row, and then the lady over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Bissinger. I'm a volunteer at the forum, and I was wondering especially what social media platforms were doing in the sense of content moderation when it comes to outsourcing those tasks to third countries, and especially in link to human rights and working conditions. Thank you.
And that's a question directed to...
It can be to the panel at a whole, but mainly addressed. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I can again speak for the whole industry. We have, I think, about 20,000 content moderators all around the world, and I do know generally that they are really spread out all across the world, and we're asking about conditions, and they have a uniform set of working conditions and standards, etc. So, the question was quite general, but from our perspective, of course, it's a tough job, and we We are aware of that, and they get the whole package of support and psychological help and all the safeguards against overexposure and that kind of stuff, including machine learning that helps limit the number of actual human interactions they need to have with really brutal, extreme content. So we are, of course, looking into constantly improving their welfare. So thank you for the question, but I don't know if such a general answer satisfies you, but I'd just like to quickly touch upon some of the themes that were just mentioned, including education. And I think this is something that we really learn to understand, that this is something we need to invest, especially if you mentioned, Iliana, psychological warfare. We need to build resilience of societies. That's the bottom line. So through media literacy, through we've launched, I don't know, maybe some of you have seen ads running on all sorts of media about pre-bunking, this new technique of kind of inoculating against common misinformation techniques. So we have one that is dedicated for this region as part of our special commitment. Especially there was also mention of lower resources for these niche, say, markets. We have also looked into that, and our CEO has committed an extra fund of 10 million to improve this exactly in the region. But this campaign is directed at the situation with Ukrainian refugees in the region. So specifically targeting the kinds of propaganda tropes that we're seeing in the media to try and debunk it before it actually impacts people. There's hence pre-bunking. And there's going to be another media literacy on YouTube, which is already launched in the US, where it's coming localized all around the world. So definitely education is one of the key elements for raising resilience. So there's the psychological warfare, as mentioned by John. It doesn't have to work to our disadvantage. If we are a resilient society, a well-educated society that can use social media as a tool for good, I think this is the right path. Thank you.
Carl, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'll be very quick because I know we're out of time. And so basically, in answer to your question, and there's no easy answer, but I think we have to understand that right now, these platforms are essentially the operating systems of our democracies. They're part of the critical infrastructure of our societies in the same way that financial institutions are and the energy infrastructure is, and they need to be heavily regulated in the same way that these sectors are. And it goes beyond the regulation. I think there just needs to be a constant dialogue between these platforms and regulators and civil society about how we manage our democracies. That's the basic responsibility that I'd like to see anyway in the next few years.
We'll take this last question, and then when you answer the question, I will also ask the speakers to make your final remarks so we can wrap this up as close to the deadline as possible. Yes, go ahead.
Von der Merwe, Senior Policy Advisor at Leiden University. You're talking about education, and whenever we're talking about protecting democratic elections, democracy, the focus tends to be on media literacy, digital literacy. I'm wondering whether we're not paying enough attention to teaching the basics of what democracy looks like. What does civil society look like? A lot of the students that I encounter, don't understand the basics of how democracies actually work, separations of power. And then when you see the rise of authoritarianism, they fall victim to some of the misinformation about how a democracy works, what it looks like, and then therefore cannot see people doing undemocratic things. So I'm wondering whether you can comment on whether we're failing on education beyond just media literacy and not updating our curriculums, especially at a younger age, high school level already. Maybe we're catching it too late.
Great question. Thank you. I would add history as well to democracy. So who wants to answer first? You all will have to answer. So who answers first? John, you want to pick it up?
Sure. Unquestionably, this question of civics and civic education, but interestingly, I like the way that you phrased it. We said, this is part of our democracy now. So how are we updating our understanding of these pieces? Let me take just a moment to say that part of what's interesting to me here, and what I appreciated the mentions of Brazil, the mentions of other efforts that are being made here, is this is a problem that can often seem eternally new, sort of starstruck by the problem. And we spend a lot of time, as some say, admiring it. I think we're further than that now, and what we're at a period, maybe we're still in trial and error, and we're figuring out what works. But really what's incumbent upon us now, and I think I heard on this panel's discussion today, is how do we identify, let's just call them, not the solution. I understand, it's not tomorrow, we'll fix it. but what are the elements of an effective response in the respective and appropriate situations? And I really feel that that's the element where I'm really interested in this conversation and where it's going, and where I hope the experts here with us will join us in that. Because that's really where we are, in some ways in my mind, is how can we learn together from our experiences to go forward?
Well, just very quickly, I think I'm very sympathetic to the question, because I think the solution to a lot of our issues around disinformation are to create more curious citizens. But that's a generational project, right? That will take 15, 20 years. And the idea that we do nothing in the meantime, or if we do nothing about the way that this disinformation circulates, is obviously inconceivable. So and then I would refer you to my previous answers on that. Yeah.
So we do have civic education. We do have also these other trainings, media trainings, so history, social sciences. So people do learn about how their democratic system works, especially in their own country. And the democratic system is not the same in every single country. Democracy is not a universal thing, meaning the same things across the whole world. But I do agree that, of course, it is important to engage and perhaps enhance this or connect these issues with other existing curricular items, such as critical thinking, also across different classes. But again, I feel like education is only part of the puzzle, and this resilience building is only going to go as far as we can to actually address the challenges and the threats of spreading manipulated information, having access to millions of people by people who have money, or the companies, etc. So I think it's only part of the puzzle, definitely playing an important role. But also I think how we teach democracy matters. It's not only what we teach. It's also that it's not just I have the right to say what I want because I live in a democratic country. No, we are part of the community. We are part of the society. It's not individualistic approach to addressing these threats, like what I as a user am protected or can do. So thinking of also the other values of empathy, of how do we relate one to each other, is also something that should be part of the education, and it seems that the focus is becoming more and more on the individualism than this collective value. So I do think that it's kind of cross-horizontal discussion.
Thank you, and Marcin, very quickly, because you have to run and we all have to run.
I have to run just quickly on that very, very good point. I think you'll see some of that thinking in what we do ahead of elections, where we do special doodles on election day. We post information about how to vote, where to vote, information on candidates and that kind of stuff, exactly trying to promote the ideas of democracy. So I think that definitely is also a very important question. And just to sum up, I think everything's been said, and as John said, we have a puzzle, but let's move beyond the kind of being surprised with the puzzle and to the solving of the puzzle. I think a lot of work, I feel since I've been at Google, a lot of work has been done, and we're moving quite in a good direction, but more education, more collaboration with civil society, even smart regulation. I think they're all elements of this puzzle, but we're moving in the right direction. I'm optimistic.
On this optimistic note, please join me in thanking the wonderful speakers who were very disciplined and very substantive, and thank you for your patience as well. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for participating in the Democratic Resilience Track of Warsaw Security Forum 2022. We will invite you back in this room at 1:15 for the Global Outlook track. Thank you again very, very much, and enjoy the break. Thank you.